Section 1 of Favourite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Pinegar. Favourite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow COWLES. Preface. In bringing together these old classics for children, the author of the book has sought to apply the rule laid down in her preceding book, The Art of Storytelling, and to paint each story against some universal background of truth. The occasional exceptions are the stories of pure fancy or delicious nonsense. None of the stories depict physical cruelty or violence, from which children instinctively shrink. Neither is craftiness or fraud or lying rewarded. Yet the stories are full of romance and adventure, and of the old-time fairy lore which children love. Changes in the original stories have been freely made when necessary to bring them into conformity with the above conditions, for these old folk and fairy tales belong to all peoples and all times, and, as in the olden days, so now, the stamp of the individual storyteller may be renewedly impressed upon them. It is hoped that the stories may prove a source of true joy to the children who read, as well as to storytellers and listeners. J. D. C. End of Section 1. Recording by James Pinegar. Section 2 of Favourite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Pinegar. Favourite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow COWLES. Section 2. The Three Lemons from Laboulaye. Once upon a time there was a prince named Kalynda who lived with his father, the king, in the Palace of Rubies. The king was growing old, and he wished, oh how he wished, that his son would marry, and he told his wish to all his people. He must have a wife who is young, and rich, and beautiful, the king said, but more than all this, she must be loving and good. So they searched all the country over for a wife for Kalynda, but the prince only ran away to the woods, and declared that he would not marry at all. The king was sad and sorry indeed, but one day a strange thing happened. As the king and the prince sat together at dinner, the prince cut his finger with a knife. 3 drops of blood fell into a dish of cream at the prince's plate. The prince stared into the dish, then suddenly exclaimed, "My father, I see a vision of a beautiful maiden whose skin is as fair and smooth as cream, and whose cheeks and lips are red as these drops of blood. I am going to seek her. When I have found her, I shall marry her, and bring her to the Palace of Rubies." With that he mounted the most magnificent horse in all the king's stables and galloped away. A long, long time he journeyed. He visited towns and villages, he entered castles and cottages, but nowhere did he see the maiden of his vision. At last, after days and weeks and months of journeying, he came to a place called World's End. There was nothing but a line of shore, and beyond it stretched sea and sky and mist. Kalynda looked about. An old man sat on the shore alone. "What sea is this, good father?" asked Kalynda. "It is the sea without a shore," replied the old man. "Away beyond the horizon, lost in the mist, is an island. 3 sisters dwell on the island, but none who go there ever come back." "But a prince may succeed where others have failed," said Kalynda, and he stepped into a boat which lay on the shore. No sooner was the prince seated than the boat shot through the water like an arrow from a bow. In a short time Kalynda came within sight of the mysterious island. Its coast was rough, and its cliffs were rugged, but the moment the boat touched the shore, Kalynda began to climb. When he reached the top he found 3 huts. He knocked at the door of the first. "I can do nothing for you," cried a snarling voice, "but go to my sister who lives beyond." Kalynda knocked at the door of the second hut. "I can do nothing for you," cried a plaintive voice, "but go to my sister who lives beyond." Carlino hurried on and knocked at the door of the third hut. "Perhaps I can help you," cried a pleasant voice, and a young woman opened the door of the hut. Carlino told her his story, and when he had finished she gave him 3 lemons and a beautiful knife with a handle of mother of pearl. "Take these," she said, "and hasten back to your father the king. When you reach the borders of your own country, stop at the first spring of water, and there you must cut in 2 these lemons. As you cut each, there will spring forth a beautiful fairy with skin like cream and lips like drops of blood. She will ask you for a drink of water. Give it to her quickly, or she will vanish from your sight. But if the first and the second leave you, be sure to capture the third. If you do not, I can do nothing more to help you. But if you give her the water quickly, she will stay with you and love you, and you shall make her your wife." Prince Carlino thanked the young woman, folded the precious lemons safely in his mantle, and hastened to his boat. He met with many adventures on the way, but at last he reached the borders of his father's kingdom, and came to the spring of water. His heart beat fast as he took his knife and cut the first lemon. Out sprang a wonderful fairy, who asked Carlino for a drink of water. But he, poor fellow, was so amazed at the wonderful sight that he stood a moment as though rooted to the ground, and immediately the fairy disappeared. "Ah, why did I lose so beautiful a creature?" cried Carlino. Then he cut the second lemon. Out sprang a fairy as beautiful as the first, and asked for a drink of water. But again Carlino was so amazed that he moved but slowly, and the fairy disappeared. "Woe is me," cried Carlino, "if I capture not the third." Then he cut the remaining lemon, and there sprang forth the most beautiful fairy of them all, and before she had finished asking for water, Carlino was upon his knees, offering her a brimming cup. The fairy, whose skin was like cream, and whose lips were like drops of blood, smiled and thanked the prince, and after drinking the water, gave him her hand. Carlino was half afraid that it was a dream from which he would awaken, but the fairy promised to marry him, and to go with him to the Palace of Rubies. "But you must go as a true princess," said Carlino. "Wait here while I hasten to my father. I will return for you with attendants, with horses, and with royal splendour. Then shall you appear before the king in a manner befitting a princess." So Carlino hastened away, and the fairy, feeling frightened at being left alone in the woods, sprang into a tree and hid among the leaves. A few moments later a black slave came to the spring to draw water. She was ugly of face and of temper, for she had never known anything in all her life but hard labour and abuse. As she stooped to fill her jar, she saw in the clear water the reflection of the fairy's beautiful face. She looked up. "Why are you there?" she cried. The fairy, who had only known love and happiness all her life, and who trusted everyone, replied, "I am waiting for the prince to come and make me his bride." Then a wicked idea came to the mind of the old slave. She would shake the fairy into the stream and take her place in the tree. Then, when the prince came, she would say that she was the fairy, and that a witch had changed her to her present ugly form. She raised her arm to shake the tree, but the fairy understood what she meant to do, and quickly flew away in the form of a dove. When the prince returned, he was quite beside himself with grief and amazement. But the old slave declared that she was the fairy in disguise, and at last he took her to the Palace of Rubies. "I will have no black slaves inherit my throne," stormed the king. But his prime minister told him that the ugly negress was a fairy in disguise, that such changes had often occurred, and that no doubt the bride would become as beautiful as before when the marriage ceremony was performed. So at last the king consented, and preparations for the wedding were begun. But the king and Prince Carlino were in great distress. One day, just before the wedding, Prince Carlino noticed, growing close to the palace wall, a little lemon tree which had not been there before. He asked about it, and the chef of the palace told him. "A dove lighted near the kitchen window, and as I needed one more for our feast I killed it. 3 drops of blood fell upon the ground, and almost at once this lemon tree sprang up." Prince Carlino looked closely at the little tree, and behold, there were 3 lemons on its branches. He seized them and ran to his room, opened the knife, which he always carried, and filled a jewelled cup with water. Then, trembling, he cut the lemons as before, and, as before, a fairy sprang from each. The first and second disappeared, but to the third he offered the cup of water. For the third fairy was his true bride, come back to him again. Everyone in the palace declared that the wicked negress should be put to death, but before this was done, the fairy said to the king, "I am sure you will grant me a wedding gift." The king was so happy that he answered, "I will give you anything that you ask." "Then," said the fairy, "give me the life of this woman now condemned to death." Truly it is a poor gift," said the king, "but I have given my word. But why do you wish it?" he added. "Ah," said the fairy bride, "she has never known anything but hard labour and abuse. I will give her a happier life, and she will find goodness through loving." "My dear," said the king, "now I know of a truth that the bride of Prince Carlino is as good as she is beautiful." So the prince and the fairy were married, and they lived happily ever after. End of section 2. Recording by James Pinegar. Section 3 of Favourite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Pinegar. Favourite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow COWLES. Section 3. The 12 Months from Laboulaye. Once upon a time a poor peasant woman was left a widow. She had a daughter whose name was Laboulaye, and a little serving maid whose name was Dobrunka. Now Dobrunka was good and kind, and as beautiful as she was good, whilst Laboulaye was proud and cruel. Dobrunka was given all the hard tasks and all the scoldings, whilst Laboulaye did only fine stitching, and was petted and praised. One day in January there was to be a party in the neighbourhood. Laboulaye could go, for though her mother was so poor, she had a fine party dress. But Dobrunka could not go, for she had nothing fit to wear. Dobrunka was very unhappy, but neither Laboulaye nor her mother cared for that. When the day of the party came, Laboulaye declared that she must have a bunch of violets to wear. "They would just match the colour of my dress," she said. "But violets do not blossom in January," exclaimed Dobrunka. "I care not," said Laboulaye, with a stamp of her foot. "You are to find me a bunch of violets, and do not come back till you bring them." Poor Dobrunka was pushed out into the cold, and the door was closed and bolted behind her. She hurried to the woods, for she knew not where else to go. The wind blew and the snow drifted, but as she reached the bare woods, she saw a light farther on. She hurried toward it, and suddenly she came to a circle of 12 stones. There was a fire in the midst of the circle, and upon each of the 12 stones sat a man clothed all about in a cloak, with a hood drawn down to his eyes. 3 of the cloaks were of dazzling white, 3 were of tender green, 3 of a golden yellow, and 3 of a rich, deep purple. Dobrunka stopped in astonishment, but she was so cold that after a moment she spoke. "Kind sirs," she said, "may I come to your fire? I am almost perished with the wind and the cold." An old man with a long white beard, who held a staff in his hand, answered her. "Come and welcome," he said. "We are the 12 months of the year, and I am January. Will you tell us who you are, and why you come here alone?" "I am Dobrunka," she answered, stretching her hands out to the fire. "I am sent here by Laboulaye and her mother to gather violets." "Violets in January?" exclaimed the old man. "What notion is this?" "It is very foolish, I know," replied Dobrunka, "but Laboulaye and her mother will beat me if I go back without them." At that the old man handed his staff to a figure clad in green. "This is a matter for you to manage, Brother March," he said. At that the figure in green arose, took the staff, stirred the fire, and rapped gently upon the ground. Immediately the air grew warm, the grass sprang up, The leaves came forth, and all about in the woods the purple violets blossomed. With a cry of delight, Dobrunka gathered all that her hands could hold of the fragrant flowers, and thanking March prettily, she hastened away. When she reached home, Zloboga and her mother were astonished, but Zloboga pinned the blossoms in her dress and went away to the party. She did not say so much as thank you to Dobrunka. The next day, having stayed out late at the party, Zloboga was more than usually cross and hard to please. "Nothing tastes good," she exclaimed as she pushed away her plate. "I wish I had a dish of strawberries. Dobrunka," she added, "where did you find the violets yesterday?" "In the woods," replied Dobrunka. "They were thick upon the ground." "Then go and get me some strawberries," commanded Zloboga. "Nothing else will satisfy me." "Strawberries in January!" exclaimed Dobrunka. "There were no strawberries in the woods." "I care not," said Zloboga with a stamp of her foot. "You must get me a dishful, and come not back till you find them." Once more Dobrunka was pushed out into the cold, and the door was shut and bolted. Frightened and cold, she again made her way to the woods. It was bitterly cold, but when she reached the edge of the woods, she saw again the shining light. She made her way to it, and holding out her hand she said as before, "Kind sirs, may I warm myself at your fire? I am almost perished with cold." Again January bade her welcome, and asked her what she sought. "I am sent for a dishful of strawberries," she said, "though it seems but a foolish errand." "Strawberries in January!" exclaimed the old man. "And will you be beaten if you go back without them?" "Yes, indeed," cried poor Dobrunka, "and the door is bolted against me till I bring them." Then January took his staff and handed it to one of the figures clad in a cloak of gold. "Brother June," he said, "you must manage this." Then June arose, and taking the staff he stirred the fire till all the air grew warm. Then he tapped upon the ground, and the grass grew green, the leaves burst forth, and the earth was dotted with red, red berries. "Oh, oh!" exclaimed Dobrunka, clasping her hands. "How good you are to me!" Then she fell upon her knees, and soon she had filled her apron with the ripe fruit. Thanking June in her prettiest manner, she hastened home, and poured the berries out before Zloboga and her mother. "Where did you find them?" asked Zloboga coldly. And when Dobrunka told her that there were many of them in the woods, she ate them greedily, but not a thank you did she say to Dobrunka. The next day it was apples that Zloboga wanted, and as before Dobrunka was sent to fetch them, and the door was bolted. Again she ran to the woods, facing the cold north wind and stumbling through the drifts of snow. But the bright light still shone, and when she reached it the circle of figures sat about the fire as on the 2 previous days. "May I come again to your fire, kind friends?" asked Dobrunka. "You are welcome," said January, "but what is your errand today?" "Today I must find apples," said Dobrunka, "and I shall be beaten if I bring them not back." Then January handed his staff to a figure clothed in a gown of deep purple, and as he did so he said, "Brother September, this is a matter for you to manage." Then September stirred the fire with the staff, and the air grew warm, and trees put forth their leaves, and the apple trees covered themselves with pink blossoms. Then the petals fell, and in their place hung many red-cheeked apples. "Shake the tree, Dobrunka," said September, and Dobrunka shook the tree. 2 ripe apples fell, and she picked them up, thanked September with a smile, and ran away home. "Only 2 apples!" exclaimed Zloboga as she entered. "Why did you not bring more?" "Only 2 fell when I shook the tree," said Dobrunka. Zloboga and her mother never before had eaten apples of so delicious a flavour. The next morning, Zloboga declared, "I am going to the woods today. I want more of those delicious apples. I am going to find the wonderful tree upon which they grow and shake down all its fruit." "Let Dobrunka bring them to you," said her mother, but Zloboga was wilful, and in spite of the cold and snow, she set out to find the wonderful tree and gather all its fruit. She ran away to the woods, and her mother, fearing that some harm would come to her, followed. But Zloboga did not see the shining light that had guided Dobrunka, and she lost her way in the snow and the cold. Dobrunka wondered and wondered when Zloboga and her mother did not come back, and after many days, for no one ever heard of them again, she became mistress of the little cottage, the cow, the garden, and the chickens. And one day a neighbour's son came to her door and asked her to marry him, and they lived in the little cottage and were happy ever afterward. End of section 3. Recording by James Pinegar.
Section 4 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Libby Marie Lennon. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow COWLES. Inger's Loaf. Once upon a time, a little peasant girl named Inger was sent to the home of a rich family in the country to act as serving maid. Now Inger was a very pretty girl, but she was proud and selfish, and this had caused her father and mother a great deal of sorrow. The rich people to whom she was sent were good to little Inger. They dressed her as prettily as they did their own little daughter, and they treated her as kindly as though she too were their own. One would think that this would have caused Inger to be kind and loving, but instead she became more and more proud and selfish. One day, when she'd been away from her home many months, her employer said to her, "Inger, it is quite time that you visited your father and mother." So Inger put on her very best shoes and her prettiest dress, and away she started. "They will be surprised to see how grand I look," she said to herself as she ran along. When she reached the edge of the village, she saw groups of young men and women walking about and talking, and seated upon a rough stone bench she saw her own mother. On her mother's back rested a bundle of sticks which she had picked up for fuel. "What will all those people say to see me talking to an old woman with a bundle of sticks on her back?" exclaimed Inger, looking at her own pretty clothes. So without speaking one word to her mother, she turned and ran back to her employer in the country. Many months passed, and then her employer said again, "Little Inger, it is time you visited your father and mother." So once more, Inger put on her very best shoes and her prettiest dress, and just as she was about to start, her employer handed her a fine fresh loaf of wheaten bread. "It is for your father and mother," she said. "They will like the fresh, sweet loaf." Now the peasants lived on coarse oat cakes, and fresh wheaten bread was a very great treat. So Inger took the loaf and started on her way. Presently she came to a spot where the ground was soft and wet. Inger stopped and looked down. "I shall spoil my pretty shoes if I step in the marsh," she said to herself, "and I want to look fine when I reach the village. I know what I will do. I will drop this loaf in the marsh and jump upon it. Then I shall keep my shoes quite clean." "But your father and mother would like the wheaten bread," a voice seemed to say. "It will be a rare treat to them, and they ofttimes have to go hungry, you know." Inger looked at the loaf, then she looked at the marsh, and last of all she looked at her shoes. "I cannot help that," she said. "I must save my pretty shoes." With that, she threw the loaf into the marsh and sprang upon it. But when she would have leapt from the loaf to the opposite side of the marsh, she could not. Her feet were held fast by the loaf, and in a moment it sank out of sight and pulled little Inger down with it. And where do you suppose Inger found herself? She found herself in the home of the old marsh wife, who was half-sister to the Elf King. Now the marsh wife and the Elf King live quite close to Bogeyland, and all sorts of queer things happen in that part of the world. But poor Inger was in a sad plight for visiting strange countries. The mud of the marsh had soiled her pretty shoes, her fine dress, and even her face and her hair. "What a dirty-looking child!" exclaimed an old woman who sat in the marsh wife's kitchen. Inger gazed at the old woman, and she did not like her. The old woman was working very fast at the strangest piece of embroidery. It was made entirely of lies, which she wove with rapid fingers. By her side were piled a heap of necklaces. These were made from idle words which she had picked up and strung together. She loved to give these necklaces away, for they always caused the wearers no end of trouble. On the other side of the old woman lay a pile of slippers. She had made them from gadabout leather, and these, too, she loved to give away, for the wearers of them could find no rest. Indeed, she was a very wicked old woman, and Inger began to tremble as she looked at her. Presently, the old woman put down her embroidery and looked at Inger through a pair of very big eyeglasses. It seemed to Inger that with those eyeglasses the old woman could see right into her heart. "Yes," said the old woman at last, "she will make a good statue for my court. May I have her?" "You are quite welcome to her," replied the marsh wife. "I do not know why she came here. What is it that she stands upon?" "It looks like a wheaten loaf," said the old woman, and she was quite right, for Inger's feet were still fast to the loaf, and neither one of them could she move. "A statue," said Inger to herself. "Statues are beautiful. I suppose she wants me because I am pretty." But no sooner had she thought this than she remembered that she was covered with mud, and that the old woman had called her a dirty child. But she had no more time in which to wonder, for the old woman had already gathered up her work and was whisking her away to Bogeyland, for that was where the old woman lived. The next that Inger knew, she was standing, still on her wheaten loaf, in a great court among many other statues, for she was now a statue herself. She could think, and she could turn her eyes and look about, but aside from this, she was as stiff as a stone. The statues about her were not pretty, but they were quite as pretty as poor Inger in her covering of brown mud. Now Inger had plenty of time to think, for she could not run about or talk or play. She could only stand in the old woman's court in Bogeyland. At first, she thought only about herself, and of how unhappy she was. But she could not shed a tear, no matter how wretched she felt. She watched the old woman at her work, and she thought of all the unhappiness and trouble she was making for other people. She saw her fashioning her gifts, embroideries of lies, and necklaces of idle words, and slippers of gadabout leather, and she thought what a wicked woman she was. Then she wondered how all the other statues came to be in the old woman's garden, and if they were as unhappy as she. But after a while, Inger did not give so much time to these unpleasant thoughts. She began to think instead about her father and mother and her kind employer. She remembered how good they had always been to her. Then she remembered how she had turned away from her mother when she had a bundle of sticks upon her back, and how she had thrown the wheaten loaf into the marsh when her father and mother had perhaps been hungry. All at once she exclaimed within herself, "Why, I am just as bad as this old woman. I was so vain and selfish that I made everyone else unhappy, for I tried only to please myself." The more Inger thought about this, the sorrier she grew, and at last she said, "Oh, if I could only give so much as a wheaten loaf to someone, how happy I should be!" Then something very strange happened. The stiff statue which had been Inger seemed all at once to melt, and away from it there flew a sober little brown bird, and the bird winged its way to the upper air. It was a very quiet, timid little bird, and it could not sing, but it crept into a crevice in a wall and watched the other birds about it. It was winter, and the waters were frozen, and the fields were covered with snow, so the birds could find but little to eat. But on Christmas Day, our little brown bird saw the people of the village tie a sheaf of grain to a pole. Then they raised the pole upright and went away and left it. And oh, how the birds flocked around and ate the grain, for that was just what the people had wished. The little brown bird hopped out with the rest and ate a kernel of wheat. Then a happy thought came to it, and away it flew. It flew along the roads where loads of grain had jolted. It lighted outside kitchen windows where crumbs were thrown, and everywhere that it went it ate just one kernel or one crumb, and it called the other birds to come and take all the rest. Here and there the little brown bird flew, hunting for food and calling the other birds whenever it found a bit to eat. It was a very happy bird. Its only sorrow was that it could not sing. But one day, when it had divided a single crumb with a tiny wren, the little brown bird heard a voice say, "Little brown bird, you've given away enough crumbs and seeds to make a whole wheaten loaf." At that, the little brown bird felt something throbbing in its throat, and the next moment it was pouring forth a beautiful song of thanksgiving. a song so sweet and pure and clear that the children playing in a nearby yard stopped to listen. And as they looked, the bird lifted its wings, and it was all pure white, and it flew happily away into the sky. End of section 4. Section 5 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Libby Marie Lennon. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow COWLES. Ole Shut-Eyes and His Dream Umbrella. Night is drawing on, and little Hialmar is sitting quietly by the fireside on a little footstool. Now Hialmar does not hear a single footfall, but just the same, someone is coming up the stairs. Someone in a coat of silk that shimmers all red and blue and green. It is Ole Shut-Eyes, the wonderful teller of dreams. He has taken off his shoes so he will not be heard, and he opens the door so that not a sound reaches Hialmar's ears. Puff! Before Hialmar can raise his eyes to look, Ole Shut-Eyes has sent into them an invisible spray, and then Hialmar's lids close, his head droops, and he is carried off to bed. But Ole Shut-Eyes steals softly in after him and sits down beside his bed. Hialmar has been a good boy all day, so Ole takes from under his arm a beautiful umbrella all covered with pictures, and he raises it over Hialmar's bed. Ole Shut-Eyes carries 2 kinds of umbrellas. One is for naughty children, and it has no beautiful pictures at all, and then there are no beautiful dreams. But Hialmar's umbrella has wonderful pictures, and Ole begins at once to tell him about them. "First," said Ole Shut-Eyes, "I'm going to make things smart." As he said this, the plants in the pots in Hialmar's room stretched up into trees. The branches blossomed forth with wonderful roses, and all the room looked like a lovely arbor. There was fruit on the trees, too, and it tasted like the richest jam, and the vines were covered with buns, just bursting with plums. Oh, it was delightful. But in the midst of all these wonders, there came a noise of grumbling, and it came from a drawer in the table. It was the drawer in which Hialmar kept his school books and slate. Ole Shut-Eyes opened the drawer. The slate was twisting itself into the most wretched shapes. "What is all this?" exclaimed Ole. "Oh, I am in great misery," said the slate. "There's a wrong figure in one of my sums, and try as I may, I cannot change it." A little pencil tied to the slate by a bit of string was tugging with all its might. "I would change the figure if I could," it cried in a creaky voice, "but I can't." At that, the copybook began to lament. Ole turned the leaves. He saw a nice stiff row of capital letters and a nice stiff row of little letters. These were the letters that were printed in the book. But beyond these were other letters that Hialmar had made. They leaned this way and they leaned that way, and some of them were almost tumbling off the line on which they were supposed to stand. Ole Shut-Eyes looked closely at them. He could see that Hialmar had tried to make them like the copy, but his small fingers could not make the lines go where they should. "We would like to be stiff and straight," wailed the letters, "but we are so crooked we can't stand up." "Dear me," said Ole Shut-Eyes, "I shall have to give you a dose of medicine." "Oh, no, no," cried all the letters together, and they stood up as stiff as anything. "Now I will drill you like soldiers," said Ole. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Oh, how stiff they stood as they marched up and down the page. But I must tell you that the next morning, when Hialmar awoke and opened his copybook, they were just as crooked as ever, and the sum hadn't come right either. The next thing that Ole Shut-Eyes did was to touch a picture that was upon the wall, and the painted birds in the trees began to fly about and sing. The grass and flowers nodded in the breeze, and the river began flowing toward the sea. Hialmar put his foot up into the picture, and there he stood under the trees. Before him on the water was a little boat, painted red and blue, and it had silver sails. Hialmar stepped into it, and away it sailed down the stream. Pretty fishes splashed about in the water and swam after the red and blue boat. The fishes had scales of silver and gold. Birds sang to Hialmar as he passed through deep woods, and the trees told him stories, dark stories about robbers and witches. Then the little boat sailed past an open space where there was a neat cottage. A young woman came out of the cottage and sang a song to him, and she was the woman who had been Hialmar's nurse, and the song she sang was one she had sung to him many, many times before, when she had held him in her arms. As the song died away, the woman and the boat both seemed to vanish. The next that Hialmar knew, old Shut-Eyes was introducing him to a little gray mouse that was on her way to a wedding. "2 of the mice who live beneath your mother's pantry floor are to be married tonight," said the mouse politely. "Would you like to attend the wedding?" "Very much," said Hialmar. "But how am I to get there? I'm too big to go through a mouse hole." "Leave that to me," said old Shut-Eyes, and in a twinkling Hialmar found himself even smaller than a mouse. He hastily put on his tin soldier's uniform, which fitted perfectly and was very grand. "Now step into this thimble of your mother's," said the mouse. "It will make an excellent carriage, and I will draw you to the wedding." So Hialmar seated himself in the thimble and was driven away to the wedding. Perhaps the thimble carriage was a teeny bit small. At any rate, Hialmar turned over in his bed and muttered, "Are there any more stories?" "There's no more time for stories," said Ole. "Tomorrow is Sunday, and I must get the world all polished up. First of all, I must see that the brownies up in the church tower are burnishing the bells. They must ring clear and true to call the people to worship. I must see that the breezes have brushed the dust from the grass and flowers. They must be fresh and sweet. Those things are easily attended to," said Ole. "But it isn't so easy to polish the stars. You see," he continued, "first of all, I have to get them down, and take them in my apron to polish them. But it doesn't do to be careless. No, indeed. I must number each star, and each star hole, so that I can put them back in their proper places. If I didn't do that, they would not stick, and we should have too many falling stars." At that, the picture of Hialmar's great-grandfather, which hung upon the wall of the room, spoke. "Now, I say, Mr. Shut-Eyes," it said, "I am quite willing that you should tell Hialmar stories, but really, you must not puzzle his brains with such stories as this. The stars cannot be taken down to be polished, you know. They are planets, like our Earth." But old Shut-Eyes smiled wisely. "Thank you, great-grandfather," he said, "but I am much older than you, and I know many things which you would not believe. However," he added, "if you do not approve of my stories, you may tell some yourself." And with that, old Shut-Eyes folded up his dream umbrella and vanished. And Hialmar determined that the next night he would turn great-grandfather's picture to the wall. End of section 5.
Section 6 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow COWLES. The Nightingale, from Andersen. Many long years ago, the Emperor of China made a very great discovery. He was reading in a book, which was a very unusual thing for him to do, and he read the words, "But the most wonderful thing in all the Empire of China is the song of the nightingale." "What is this?" cried the Emperor. "The nightingale in my own empire, and I have never met her? Who is she? I must find her. I must hear her sing. It is strange," he added, "that people of other countries know more about my empire than I do myself. Now and then one may really learn something from books." So the Emperor summoned a lord-in-waiting and said to him, "I have just read about the song of the nightingale, but I do not know her. See that she appears at court this evening. I must hear her sing." The lord-in-waiting bowed very low and hastened away. He never had heard of the nightingale either, and had no idea where she was to be found. But he ran all through the castle, upstairs and down, through corridors and chambers, and everywhere he inquired about the nightingale, but no one knew who she was, or where she could be found. The lord-in-waiting bowed low before the Emperor and told him this. "What!" exclaimed the Emperor. "The song of the nightingale is the most wonderful thing in my kingdom, and no one knows who she is? She must be brought to the court this evening. If she is not, the whole court shall be trampled upon." "Tsing Pe!" cried the lord-in-waiting, and again he searched the castle, and half the court ran after him, for they did not want to be trampled upon. At length a simple little kitchen maid heard the uproar, and timidly she said, "I know the nightingale. I can show you where she lives. Indeed, I have often heard her sing." At that the whole court set out on the heels of the lord-in-waiting, and he in turn ran after the little kitchen maid. They left the castle, passed through the beautiful gardens of the Emperor, and at last found themselves in the deep green woods. None of the court ever had been there before. Then the little kitchen maid pointed to a small gray bird perched upon the branch of a tree. "There is the nightingale," she said. The lord-in-waiting could scarcely recover from his surprise. He never had dreamed that the nightingale would prove to be a sober little gray bird. But he delivered the Emperor's message and bade the little bird appear at court that evening. "I sing best among the green trees," said the nightingale, "but if the Emperor wishes, I will come." The castle was decorated for the occasion, and a wonderful golden cage was made for the nightingale. At the appointed time she came, and when she sang, her song was so clear and pure and sweet that tears formed in the Emperor's eyes and ran down upon his cheeks. When she had finished, the Emperor was so pleased that he said she should remain at court. She should live in the golden cage, and should have many attendants to wait upon her. He even offered to hang his golden slipper about her neck, but this the nightingale declined. She would have been much happier in her home in the green wood, but what the Emperor commands must be done. So she lived at court in a golden cage, close beside the Emperor's couch, and she sang whenever the Emperor commanded. One day a packet came addressed to the Emperor. "Perhaps it is another book," said he. But when it was opened, he found not a book, but a most marvelous bird. It was made of silver and gold, studded with precious jewels, and inside the bird were springs and wheels, so that when they were wound, the bird could sing. Truly, this were a new marvel, and when the Emperor had heard the jeweled bird sing, he cared no more for the true nightingale, and she was allowed to fly away to her home in the green woods. The jeweled bird was placed in the golden cage, and the golden slipper was hung about her neck. Many times a day the golden bird was wound and made to sing for the Emperor. It was much grander than a living bird, for any one could hear a living bird sing. But one morning, when the attendant wound the springs, there was a sudden whir. The spring had broken. The jeweled bird could sing no more. It was sent away to be mended, but no one in all the Emperor's kingdom knew how to repair it. A watchmaker did the best that he could, but after that it could only be wound once a year, and then it had to be done very carefully. Many, many moons passed, and then one day it was whispered that the Emperor was very ill. It was not thought that he could live. He lay very still and white on his silken couch, and his attendants were frightened and thought him dead. So they hastened away to tell the people that the Emperor was dead. But when they had gone, the Emperor turned his head toward the little golden bird and whispered, "Music, I want music." But the little bird could not sing, for there was no one there to wind it. "Music, you little golden bird," whispered the Emperor, "I have loaded you with gifts. Sing to me now." But the jeweled bird could not sing. The Emperor turned his head. What was that at the open window? The little gray nightingale had heard that the Emperor was ill, and she had flown to the window to sing to him. And in a moment her sweet, clear song filled all the room with melody. She sang of life and hope, and as she sang, the Emperor's cheeks grew ruddy and his strength returned. The door opened and the attendants came softly in to care for the dead Emperor. But what was their astonishment when he arose and said, "Good morning." End of section 6.
Section 7 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow COWLES. The Six Swans from Grimm. Once upon a time there were 7 children who lived alone in a great castle, hidden deep in the heart of a forest. 6 of the children were boys, the 7th was a girl. Their father was the king who ruled over the country, and he loved his children dearly. But to save his own life, after the death of the queen, their mother, he was forced to marry a woman who was a witch. He knew well that she would not be kind to his children, so he placed them in the castle in the forest, and went secretly to visit them as often as he could. But after a time the witch-wife began to wonder who it was that the king went away to see. So she gave a sum of money to one of the servants, and the servant told her about the children of the king, and how she could find her way to the castle in the forest. So, one day, when the king had gone out hunting, the witch-wife followed the secret path through the forest, and when she came near the castle, she made a great tramping, as though a heavy man were walking. The sister, who was busy in the house, did not hear, but the 6 boys who were outside heard his footsteps, and thinking that it was their father coming, ran down the path to meet him. Then the witch-wife threw over each one a little white shirt, and as soon as the shirts touched them, they were changed into white swans, and they flew away to the water. Now the servant had not told how many children the king had, so the witch-wife supposed that she had changed them all into swans, and she went away home satisfied. But the king's little daughter had looked from the window of the castle just in time to see her brothers changed into swans, and had watched them fly away. She was quite broken-hearted at the sight, and went sadly about the castle all day. But at evening she heard a fluttering of wings, and suddenly 6 white swans flew down to the castle and lighted before her. They blew upon one another, and their feathers were stripped off like coats, and her 6 brothers stood before her in their own forms. One of them spoke quickly. "We can remove our coats with swan feathers and resume our own forms for only 15 minutes, he said. "But what can I do to help you?" exclaimed their sister, wiping away her tears. "Is there no way that I can bring you back to stay?" "The way is too difficult," answered one of the brothers. "But tell me," exclaimed the girl. "There is but one way," replied her brother. "For 6 years you must let no word of sound fall from your lips, and during the 6 years you must stitch together leaves of the starwort, and make us 6 shirts. But it is too difficult," he added. "You cannot do it." Then, as the 15 minutes were spent, the 6 brothers resumed the form of swans and flew away from the castle. "I will do it," said the sister, and then she closed fast her lips and ran away from the castle. She travelled a long distance till she came to the place where the starwort grew. Then she picked a quantity of leaves and began to sew. Day after day she spent picking the leaves of starwort and sewing them with the finest stitches possible. No word passed her lips, and she neither sang nor laughed. One day, while she was thus occupied, a prince with his retinue passed her as she worked. The prince turned back and spoke, but though the maiden smiled, she shook her head and said no word. The prince was puzzled, but no answer could he get to his questioning. Day after day he came back, for the silent maiden fascinated him, and at last he asked her to marry him. She shook her head and laid her finger on her silent lips, but she smiled as she did so, and the prince became the more determined to make her his bride. Each day he came to see her, and she began to watch for his coming and to count the hours after he had gone. Then, one day, when he again begged her to marry him, she smiled and laid her hand in his. The prince was so happy that he sent at once for a priest, and they were married, and he led her to his father's house. But though she was so happy, the wife did not speak, and each day she sewed on the shirts of starwort. But the queen, the mother of the prince, did not like the choice that he had made, and, as she was a wicked woman, she invented evil stories about his wife, and told them to the prince. At last the queen convinced him that his wife was a witch, and, though he still loved her, and it almost broke his heart to do it, he was obliged to consent to the queen's plan that his wife be placed in a dungeon and left there the remainder of her life. When he told his girl wife this, she threw her arms about him, and tears rained down her face. But no sound passed her lips. Then they wept together, and although the prince told her that he loved her as well as ever, he said that the king and queen had determined that she must be sent to the dungeon, and he could not alter their plan. With trembling hands, the young wife gathered up the 6 little shirts of starwort, for she had almost completed the last one. Only a sleeve remained unfinished, for the 6th year was almost past. As they led her out of the castle, there was heard a sudden rush of wings, and 6 beautiful swans lighted in the path before her, for at that moment the 6th year was ended. Instantly she threw over them the 6 shirts of starwort, and immediately the coats of feathers dropped off, and 6 handsome young men stood in the path, though one of them, on whom the unfinished shirt had fallen, had a swan's wing in place of one arm. Then their sister turned with a glad cry to her husband the Prince, and told him of the enchantment which the witch wife had thrown over her brothers, and of the penance she had done to break the enchantment. Then the Prince took her in his arms, and led her and her brothers back to the castle, where there was great feasting and rejoicing, and the Prince loved his wife more dearly than ever. End of section 7. Recording by Esther Camus.
Section number 8 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Giordano. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow COWLES. The Enchanted Mead, a Korean folk tale. Once upon a time, there was an old woman lived upon a river bank, where the ferry boats crossed. She was poor, and often had only a bowl of rice for her dinner. She had no family, unless one may call a faithful dog and a mischievous cat a family. But dog Trophy, Thomas the cat, and the old woman lived very happily, and were the best of friends. It was only now and then that they went hungry to bed. One day a stranger stopped at the old woman's cottage. "I am weary and thirsty," he said. "Can you give me refreshment?" Now the old woman had only a bit of bread and one last sup of mead, but seeing the stranger's weariness, she offered them heartily. "Thank you," said the stranger when he had finished. "I cannot offer you money, but if you will drop this bit of amber into your jug, you will never find it empty of mead." And handing the old woman a clear, yellow stone, he disappeared. Wondering and curious, the old woman dropped the bit of amber into the jug. At once the jug felt heavy, for it was full of mead. The old woman was delighted, and so plainly did she show her joy, that dog Trophy and Thomas the cat seemed to understand her good fortune, and capered about to express their pleasure. Now good times came to the little cottage, for, since the jug was always full, yet required no filling, the old woman set up a little shop where travellers, crossing the ferry, could stop for a bit of bread and a sup of mead. The cat and the dog often talked things over at night, and they understood about the magic bit of amber, for not once had they gone to bed supperless, since the stranger had left the curious stone. The jug was always guarded by one of the three. But one day the old woman took up the jug, and it was empty. She shook it. No merry stone tinkled against its side. Then the old woman knew that in pouring the mead for a customer, the bit of amber must have been poured out too. But into whose cup or jug it had gone, she had not the least idea. She was filled with despair. "I have no other means of support," she said sadly. "Must I go hungry again in my old age?" Dog Trophy's lively expression changed to one of deep woe, and his tail dropped dejectedly. Thomas the cat lost his usually cheerful grin, and lashed his sides with a bristling tail. At night, as usual, they talked matters over. "I know," said Thomas, "that I could find the bit of stone by the smell, if I could get somewhere near it. But how is one to begin?" "We will set out," said dog Trophy, "and visit every house in the neighborhood. Let us start at once, while our old mistress sleeps." "Ready," said Thomas, and off they went. They visited every house on that side the river, but not once did Thomas get a whiff of the precious amber. "The river is frozen," said Trophy at length. "Let us cross to the other side. We have spent many nights in searching, but we must not give up yet." So together they crossed the river, for the ice was firm, and began their search on the farther side. Dog Trophy made the acquaintance of all the dogs, while Thomas went inside and called upon the house cats. One night, as he was walking stealthily along a beam in one of the houses, he caught a sniff of the longed-for odor. It told him that the stone was near, and he was so delighted that he almost lost his hold upon the beam. But it was well that he did not, for he would have fallen straight upon the bald head of the man who owned the house. He regained his balance and followed the scent, which grew stronger and stronger the farther he went. At last he came to a heavy box, the cover of which was fitted so closely that he could not move it. Try as he would, the cover could not be raised. So Thomas went outside to consult with Dog Trophy. "The box cannot be moved, and the lid cannot be lifted," said Thomas, "but I am sure the stone is inside." "There is but one thing to do then," said Dog Trophy, who was very wise. "And what is that?" asked Thomas, respectfully. "Get the mice to gnaw a hole in the box," said Trophy. At that Thomas grinned. "And how will we win a favor from the mice, we who chase and eat them on every occasion?" "Let us sign an agreement not to touch a rat or a mouse for a whole year," said Trophy. And that is what they did, though they had some trouble in getting a hearing with the mice. But it was a very good bargain, the mice admitted, and so a hole was gnawed in the box, and a very small mouse squeezed through and brought out the bit of amber. How Dog Trophy and Thomas the cat rejoiced, and how glad their mistress would be! They hurried down to the river bank, but when they reached the river they saw that the ice was gone. Spring had come while they were carrying on their search. There was no way for them to get back, except to swim. But Thomas, of course, could not swim. But Dog Trophy was never at a loss for a plan. "Get on my back," he said, "and hold that bit of amber in your mouth. Whatever happens, do not lose the amber. I will carry you safe across." With that he plunged into the water, while Thomas clung fast to his long hair. Thomas wanted to laugh at this new way of riding, but he dared not, for fear he might lose the stone. They were almost across, when a sudden splash of water flew straight into Thomas's face. He sneezed, when down dropped the precious stone into the river. Trophy saw it go, and dived for it, and such a wetting as Thomas got, but the stone had disappeared. Thomas got to the bank somehow, and ran up a tree to dry his fur. Then he arched his back, and spit at Dog Trophy for giving him such a ducking, while Dog Trophy barked furiously up the tree at Thomas for losing the precious stone. When he had barked his throat quite raw, Dog Trophy went sadly down to the river bank. A man was standing near, fishing. Presently the fisherman drew out a large fish, and thoughtlessly threw it upon the bank. A familiar scent greeted Dog Trophy's nostrils, and instantly he caught up the fish and dashed away with it to his mistress. The old woman was glad indeed to see her faithful dog, and glad also of a good meal of fish. But when she opened the fish to dress it, what do you suppose she found? Her precious bit of amber lay in the stomach of the fish. There was happiness and plenty in the little cottage once more. But Dog Trophy and Thomas the cat have never been good friends since. End of Section 8. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 9 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Darrow COWLES. The White Cat from D'Aulnoy. Once upon a time, many years ago, a little girl was given by her mother to the fairies, and they were to bring her up. The fairies were good to her, and she was very happy. She grew up and was accomplished and very beautiful. She was a princess, for her father was a king and her mother was a queen. But one day the princess disobeyed the fairies and made them very angry with her. So, for a punishment, they changed her into a beautiful white cat. They gave her a palace to live in, a most wonderful palace, which was lighted by the sparkling of hundreds of precious jewels, and a retinue of servants to wait upon her. But each servant, like herself, had been changed into the form of a cat. One day there came to the palace a young man, a prince, who had been sent away from home on a strange errand. His father, who was king of a distant country, had sent him out to find the most remarkable dog in all the world. The prince had traveled far when he saw the beautiful palace with walls of glass, having all the tints of the rainbow, doors of gold, and lights formed by dazzling sapphires, rubies, and emeralds. Never had the prince seen so marvelous a building, and he rang a bell at the entrance, wondering as he did so who could it be that lived in the midst of such luxury and beauty. What was his surprise, then, upon being admitted to the palace, to discover that all the inmates were cats. But never had he been treated with greater hospitality. A beautiful room was placed at his disposal, a bath of perfumed water was prepared, and later a dinner of the richest foods was set before him. He noticed, however, that 2 plates were laid at the table, and he wondered with whom he was to dine. But while he wondered, a beautiful white cat came gracefully into the room and took her seat at the table. "Prince," she said, addressing him, "I hope my servants have made you comfortable. While we eat, will you tell me from what country you come and something of your journey?" The prince was filled with amazement, but he was careful not to show his surprise. He told her of the strange errand upon which he had been sent by his father, the king. "I have a year in which to find the most remarkable dog in the world," he added. "Make yourself comfortable here as long as you like," said the white cat graciously. "Perhaps you may find the dog you are in search of near by." The prince thanked her, for he was charmed by her gracious manner, and filled also with curiosity. He lingered at the palace day after day, for it was the most wonderful and the most beautiful place that he had ever seen, and each day he wondered more and more at the charm and good breeding of the white cat, and at her many accomplishments. But one morning the thought came suddenly to him that he had but 3 days more in which to find the most remarkable dog in the world, and return with it to his father's castle. He was filled with remorse at having lingered so long. "Do not regret your stay," said the white cat. "I have found for you the most remarkable dog in the world, and you shall take it to your father." With that she handed him an acorn. The prince, in wonder, held the acorn to his ear, and to his joy and amazement heard within it the faint barking of a dog. Bidding the white cat farewell, he hastened to the king, and in his presence opened the acorn. Out jumped the tiniest and most perfect little dog imaginable. It could easily jump through a lady's finger ring. The king was delighted, and wanted all his court to see the wonderful dog. But a few days later he again called his son to him and said, "My son, I must have a piece of muslin fine enough to be drawn through the eye of a needle. You, I am sure, can find it for me. You may have a year in which to secure it." The prince was rather glad of another opportunity to travel, for of course he went directly to the palace of the white cat, and to her he told his second quest. "Have no fear," said she. "My servants can produce the muslin for you, and we shall be glad to entertain you until it is time for you to return to your father." So for another year the Prince remained in the palace of the White Cat, enjoying the beauty and comfort of its wonderful gardens, its baths, and its works of art. But most of all, the Prince enjoyed the company of the White Cat, whom he found more intelligent, more witty, and more charming in manner than any lady of his father's court. At the end of the second year the White Cat came to him, and placing in his hand an apple seed, said, "You must return now to your father's castle. Open the seed in his presence, for it contains the object of your search." "But how can I leave you, my good friend?" said the Prince sorrowfully, "and how can I ever repay you?" "You may be sent upon a third quest," said the White Cat in a soft voice. "To have you return will fully repay me." So the Prince rode away to his father, and when he reached the castle and opened the apple seed, he drew forth 400 yards of muslin, so fine that it could easily be drawn through the eye of the finest needle. The King was delighted and filled with wonder, but yet he was not satisfied. "You must go upon one more quest, my son," he said, "and then, if you are successful, I will give you my kingdom, and you shall rule in my stead. Bring back with you, at the end of a year, the most beautiful princess in all the world, and the kingdom shall be yours." So once more the Prince set out, straight to the palace of the White Cat. But this time he was sad as he repeated his father's words. "Have no fear," said the White Cat, "all will be well at the end of the year." But never did a year pass so quickly as this one. There were feasts and music, fireworks, and 1,000 entertainments provided by the attendants of the White Cat. It lacked but a few days of time for the Prince's return, when he exclaimed sorrowfully, "I would rather stay with you, dear White Cat, than marry the most beautiful princess in the world and rule over my father's kingdom. Become a mortal for my sake, or use some magic to turn me also into a cat." At the words a sudden flash blinded the Prince, and when he again looked, there stood before him, not the White Cat, but a girl of radiant beauty. With a dazzling smile she cried, "You have broken by your words the spell which the fairies threw over me. I am indeed a princess, but when I angered the fairies they changed me into the form of a white cat." As she spoke, her attendants, who had also been changed back to their human forms, came into the room, and they made the Princess ready, and she went with the happy Prince to the castle of his father the King, where they were married and lived happily ever after. End of section 9. Section 10 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow COWLES. The Miller's Daughter, a Slav Folktale. Once upon a time there was born to a rich nobleman a beautiful baby boy, and there was great rejoicing and feasting in the castle. When the nobleman's friends came together for the christening, the fairies came too. Each fairy brought a gift, but one of them was in a bad humor, and when it was her turn to bestow her gift, she said, "Your son shall grow to manhood only upon one condition: his feet must not touch the floor before he is 12 years of age." The nobleman was greatly distressed at this, but it could not be altered, so he had a cradle made of gold, with high sides, and he hired the most careful nurses in all the country around to wait upon and watch his boy. And the boy grew, and was strong and sturdy, and everyone about the castle loved him and watched over him carefully. At last his 12th birthday drew near, and his father ordered a splendid feast. There was a great bustle of preparation while everyone rejoiced. But in the midst of this happiness and confusion there came a sudden noise of grief and crying, and the walls of the castle began to tremble and shake. At this the attendant who was with the boy became quite frantic with fear. She jumped to her feet to see what all this could mean, and the boy fell to the floor. Instantly the cries ceased, the walls of the castle stood firm as before, but the nobleman's son could not be found. Search was made everywhere, but no trace of him was left. The nobleman offered a reward of 300 crowns in gold to anyone who could bring him news of his son, but no one came to claim the reward. Then the nobleman shut himself up in his castle. His gardens were neglected, and all his joys seemed gone. Now at a little distance from the nobleman's castle there lived a miller with his wife and 3 daughters. One day the oldest daughter went for a walk in the woods. She grew very tired and was wishing for a place to rest, when close beside her path she saw a neglected summer house that belonged to the estate of the nobleman. She pushed aside the vines and bushes, and as she did, she discovered, fastened to the door of the summer house, a notice, long yellowed by the sun and rain. It was the offer of 300 crowns in gold for news of the nobleman's son. "I wish I might earn the reward," said the girl. "It would make me a fine dowry, and then I could marry well." She pushed open the door, and what was her surprise to see a fire laid ready to light, a table set with dainty food, and a couch draped with fine tapestries. Over the fireplace some letters were carved, which read, "Of comforts here partake, but of thy speech beware." "Of comforts here partake," she repeated, "then I may rest and eat." She sat down to taste the food, but as she did so, there came a sound of sighing and crying. She was frightened, but when she turned toward the door, a young man stood before her. "For whom are the fire and the food and the couch?" asked he. "For myself," answered the girl proudly. As she said this, the young man looked troubled. Then, as suddenly as he had come, he was gone. When the girl turned again, the fire, the table, and the couch had vanished as completely as the young man had done. She returned home, but she said nothing to her sisters about her adventure. A few days later the second daughter took a walk through the woods, and she too, becoming weary, chanced upon the same summer house. The notice was still upon the door, and as she read it, she said, "I wish that I might gain the reward. I could dress well all the rest of my life upon 300 gold crowns, and I should have rich friends." She pushed open the door, and to her surprise found a fire laid ready to light, a table spread with dainty food, and a richly draped couch. And over the fireplace she read the words, "Of comforts here partake, but of thy speech beware." She was very hungry, and as she was used to plain and simple fare, she sat down at once at the daintily laid table. But before a mouthful of food had touched her lips, she heard sighs and a sound of weeping. Springing up, she faced a young man who said to her, "For whom is the fire laid?" "For myself," answered the girl. "For whom is the table spread?" he asked. "For myself," she answered again. "And for whom is the couch prepared?" he asked again. "For myself," was the reply. The young man sighed, looked troubled, then vanished from sight. And when the girl turned back, nothing was to be seen of the fire, the daintily set table, or the couch. But neither did she say anything at home of the strange adventure. Several days passed, and then the youngest daughter went for a walk in the woods. She too chanced upon the summer house, as her sisters had done. "I wish I might win the reward," she said as she read the weather-stained notice upon the door. "Father should have a new wheel for his mill, and mother should have a silk gown." She pushed open the door and saw to her surprise the fire, the table, and the couch. Then she read the words, "Of comforts here partake, but of thy speech beware." "Why, these are for me then," she said, "and one should always be careful of his speech." She lighted the fire and sat down at the table, but as she did so she heard a sound of sighing and crying. She turned about, and there stood a young man. "For whom is the fire?" he asked, looking troubled. "You are welcome to warm yourself by it," said the girl. "And for whom is the table prepared?" "For you, if you are hungry," she replied. "And for whom is the couch made ready?" he questioned again. "For you, if you are weary," she answered once more. At that the young man's face lighted with joy. "Ah," he cried, "I am the lost son of the nobleman in the great castle. The fairy threw a spell over me, and I could not return to my father until some mortal showed me a kindness. You have done so. Come." He took the miller's youngest daughter by the hand and led her to his father. The nobleman was happy beyond words. The miller had his new mill wheel, the miller's wife had a new silk gown. The nobleman's son took the miller's youngest daughter for his bride, and they all lived happily ever after. End of section 10.
Section 11. Our favorite fairy tales retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Darrow COWLES. The Beauty and the Beast from Villeneuve. Once upon a time, there was a rich merchant who had 3 daughters. The youngest was called Beauty, because she was so kind and lovable and pretty. But the 2 older daughters were proud and selfish. One day the merchant received a letter which called him away from home. When he left, he asked each of his daughters what he should bring her when he returned. The eldest asked for a necklace of pearls. The second wanted a dress of silk embroidered in gold. But Beauty gave her father a kiss and said, "I think I should like best of all a bunch of beautiful roses." The merchant reached the city, and there he received bad news. His ships had been lost in a storm, and all his wealth had vanished. He returned homeward, sad and discouraged. "I must now move into the little cottage on the farm which I own," he said to himself, "for I have lost everything else. Beauty will not mind," he added. "She will keep the cottage neat and love me as much as ever. But my 2 older daughters will be cross and unhappy. Woe is me, that I have lost my wealth." As he went on with these sorrowful thoughts for company, he looked up and saw before him a light. He was weary and hungry, so he followed the light and was amazed to come upon a beautiful palace set in the midst of the forest. But no one answered when he knocked, and at last he made bold to enter. He went from room to room, but no one appeared. At last he came to a room in which there was a table richly spread for but a single person. "Surely this is a fairy palace," he exclaimed, and he sat down to eat. When he had finished, he looked further, and found a bed all prepared as though ready for a guest. So he thankfully undressed and had a night's sound sleep. In the morning he searched again for the owner of the palace, but finding no one, he ate the breakfast which was bountifully set out, and then he prepared to leave. As he walked through an arbor upon which hung the most beautiful roses he ever had seen, he suddenly remembered Beauty's request. "I cannot take home a necklace of pearls, or a gold embroidered gown," he said sadly, "but I can take a bunch of roses to Beauty." With that he reached up and broke off a full cluster, but at the same instant he heard a terrible roar, and in the path before him there appeared a most hideous beast. "I gave you food and lodging," said the beast, "but I allow no one to touch my roses. The penalty for breaking them is death." The frightened merchant fell upon his knees and pleaded with the beast. He told him about Beauty, and that it was only for her sake that he had broken off the beautiful flowers. "Very well," said the beast, "I will let you go home upon one condition. You must promise to return in a week's time. If one of your daughters chooses to come in your place, then you may go free." The poor merchant promised faithfully to return, and hastened away. He was glad that he could see his daughters once more. before he could be slain by the terrible beast. But he was sad at heart as he journeyed toward his home. Upon reaching there, he told his daughters how he had lost his wealth, and that they must move into the little cottage on the farm. Then, handing the bunch of roses to Beauty, he told them the story of the beast, and of his promise to return. The older daughters bemoaned the loss of all their father's wealth, and blamed Beauty for the added trouble her roses had brought upon them all. But Beauty threw her arms about her father's neck and said, "I shall go in your place, dear father." "No, no," he cried. But Beauty could not be turned from her purpose, and when at the end of the week her father started for the palace of the beast, Beauty went by his side. "Did you come of your own accord?" asked the beast in a terrible voice when he saw her. "Yes," replied Beauty, turning pale and trembling, for the beast was very ugly to look upon. But when Beauty went through the palace, she found that the most beautiful rooms of all were marked Beauty's rooms, and she said to her father, "Perhaps the beast will not kill me, after all. Why should these rooms be made ready for me if I am not to live here?" So her father went back home somewhat comforted. That evening when Beauty's supper was made ready, the beast came to eat with her. Beauty trembled, and could scarcely swallow a mouthful, though the food was the finest and best she ever had tasted. "Do you think me very ugly, Beauty?" asked the beast. "Yes," replied Beauty, "but you may be very kind." "Will you marry me, Beauty?" asked the beast. "Oh, no," said Beauty with a shudder. "I could not do that." Everything possible was done at the palace to make Beauty comfortable and happy, but every evening the beast came to eat with her, and every evening he asked her the same question, "Beauty, will you marry me?" And every evening Beauty answered, "No." But the beast was so kind and good to her that Beauty did not think so much now about how ugly he looked, and she began to feel sorry for him. He looked so sad when she answered "No." The beast had placed a magic mirror in Beauty's room, and when she looked in it, she had only to wish, and she could see whatever she desired. One day she said to herself, "I wish I could see what they are doing at home, and how my father is." Then she looked in her magic mirror, and there she saw her father lying ill in the little farm cottage, while her sister sat by looking cross and sulky, and the room was in dreadful disorder. "Oh, dear beast!" she exclaimed, when he came in to supper that night. "My father is ill at home, for he fears that I am dead. He needs me. May I not go to him and comfort him?" "Will you come back to me, Beauty?" asked the beast. "I cannot live without you." Beauty readily promised that she would come back in a week. Then the beast slipped a ring upon her finger and said, "You have only to turn the ring 3 times on your finger and wish, and you will be at home. Turn it again 3 times and wish, when you are ready to return. But remember," he added, "that if you do not return when you promise, I shall die." So Beauty promised again, thanked the beast, and turning her ring, found herself at once in her father's cottage. How thankful her father was to see her alive! It made him quite well at once. Then Beauty, although she was dressed in the beautiful garments which the beast had given her, went about setting the cottage to rights. while her sisters plied her with all sorts of questions about the Beast, his palace, and the wonderful gifts that he showered upon her. They were quite ill-natured and envious, but Beauty was light-hearted and merry, and her father wondered how he ever could let her leave him again. In fact, there was so much work to be done to make things comfortable, and her father and sisters played so hard for her to remain, that Beauty stayed on until she had been gone 10 days. Then at night she had a dream, and in her dream she saw the Beast lying in his bower of roses, ill and suffering. She wakened, and filled with unhappiness, she turned her ring 3 times, and wished herself back. At once she found herself in the bower, kneeling beside the Beast. "Oh, dear Beast!" she exclaimed, "have I killed you by my thoughtlessness, when you have been so good and kind to me?" The Beast opened his eyes. "I should have died without you," he said. "Beauty, will you marry me?" "Yes, dear Beast," said Beauty, "for I have learned to love you for your goodness and kindness." Instantly the covering of fur fell from the Beast, and he arose and stood before her, no longer a Beast but a handsome Prince, clothed in garments of silver, for Beauty's words had broken his enchantment. So they were married, and lived happily ever after. End of section 11.
Section 12 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Darrow COWLES. The Tortoise-Shell Cat. From Grimm. Once upon a time there was a miller who lived all alone at his mill, except for 3 apprentices. He had neither wife nor child, and he was growing old. "I shall not be long for this world," he said to himself, "and I must leave my mill to one of my apprentices, but which one shall it be?" Then the old miller fell a-thinking. He was very fond of horses, at least he was sure he would be fond of them, for he admired them very much, though he had never owned one. At last he cried, "I know what I will do. I want a fine horse, the most of anything I can think of. I will send out my 3 apprentices, and the one who brings me back the finest horse shall have my mill and all else that I leave in the world." So he called the 3 apprentices to him, and told them all that was in his mind. "Now go," he cried, "and see who shall bring me the finest horse." So early next morning the 3 apprentices started out. Now one of them, named Hans, was smaller and younger than the others, and the 2 older ones said, "What can he do? One of us will be sure to win." When night came on they were weary with traveling, and they lay down to sleep in a wood. Early in the morning the 2 older apprentices wakened. "Let us steal away and leave Hans," said one of them. "He will only hinder us in our search." And as the other agreed, they stole quietly away, leaving Hans fast asleep in the woods. The sun was shining when Hans wakened. He rubbed his eyes and looked about. Then he shouted, but no trace could he find of the 2 who had gone. "Alas, what shall I do?" cried Hans. "I do not know the way of the woods." "Are you in trouble?" asked a voice close beside him. Hans started in surprise, for the speaker was none other than a beautiful tortoise-shell cat. "Yes," replied Hans, as soon as he could speak for amazement. "I have been left here alone in the woods, and I do not know my way." "Ah, I see," said the cat pleasantly. "But do not be alarmed. You set out in search of a horse, and you shall find one if you do as I bid you." Hans was more than ever amazed at this speech, but he knew at once that this must be an enchanted cat. "I shall be glad to do as you bid me," he said. "Very well," answered the cat. "You are to serve me well and faithfully, as I require, and in the end I will give you a handsomer horse than any you have ever seen." So Hans went gladly with the cat, and soon they came to a great castle. "This is where I dwell," said the cat simply. 2 servants in livery came out to meet them, and they too were cats, as were all the attendants and inhabitants of the castle. After Hans entered the palace, he was waited upon by cats, his meals were served by cats, his room was cared for by cats, but never before had Hans lived upon such fine fare amidst such beautiful surroundings. Upon the first day of his stay at the castle, the Tortoise-Shell Cat presented him with a silver hatchet. "This is for chopping wood," she said. "You are to go into the forest each day and chop enough wood to keep the castle warm." What a task, thought Hans, but he said nothing, and when he reached the forest he began to swing his silver hatchet. What was his surprise to find that a tree fell with every blow, for it was an enchanted hatchet, and in a short time he had wood enough to fill all the fireplaces in the castle and some to spare. Soon after this he was given another task. He was to cut the grass in the meadows adjoining the castle, so that the horses in the stables might have hay. For this task he was given a scythe of silver and a whetstone of gold. The scythe, like the hatchet, was enchanted, and Hans' task was completed before he would have believed it possible. Hans' evenings were spent in visiting with the Tortoise-Shell Cat, and they became very good friends, indeed, for she was kind and intelligent and accomplished. The other cats furnished entertainment, and the days went by quickly. One morning the Tortoise-Shell Cat said to Hans, "I want a new castle. It will be a small castle, but it is to be made of silver and gold, and you must build it for me." "I?" cried Hans, thinking that now an impossible task had been set before him. But the Tortoise-Shell Cat showed him all the material for the castle, such as beams and joists and frames, and they were all of silver and gold. And when Hans began building, he found that all the parts fitted perfectly, and the golden spikes were driven in with one blow of his hammer. When the castle was completed, Hans addressed the Tortoise-Shell Cat and said, "I have finished the 3 tasks you set me. Now I would like to receive the horse I have earned, that I may take him to my master." So the Tortoise-Shell Cat led the way to her stables, and there were 12 horses, each one handsomer than any that Hans had ever seen. Hans was almost overcome between joy and fear. Could it be possible that one of these horses was to be the reward for his labor? Then the Tortoise-Shell Cat spoke. "Go back to your master," she said. "I will have 2 of my servants show you the way. See what the other 2 apprentices have brought, but do not be discouraged. In 3 days I will send your horse to you. Do not fear." So Hans left the castle and made his way back on foot to the mill, the 2 cats in livery showing him the way, though he was dressed in the old clothes he had worn when he reached the castle. In the meantime, the 2 older apprentices had returned. "See, master," the first one said, "I have brought you a horse as you wished. It was the very best I could find. I hope it will please you." Then the miller looked at the horse, and he said, "How is this? The horse is blind. Did you think to cheat me?" Just then the second apprentice appeared, leading a horse, and he too said, "See, master, I have brought you a horse, as you wished. It was the very best that I could find. I hope it will please you." Then the miller looked at the horse, and he said, "How is this? The horse is lame. Did you think to cheat me?" But he had hardly finished speaking when Hans came walking down the road with no horse at all. Then they all cried, "How is this, Hans? Where is your horse?" "My horse will follow me in 3 days," said Hans, for he was sure he could trust the Tortoise-Shell Cat. But the other apprentices laughed, and the miller sent him to the goose house to sleep. The apprentices returned to their work, and the miller was puzzling his brains to know who should have the mill, when they all heard music, and looking out they saw a royal procession coming from the direction of the forest. First of all came a man in rich livery, leading a beautiful black horse that stepped daintily and held his head high. After that came a golden carriage drawn by 8 other fine horses, and in the carriage sat a princess of wonderful beauty. And the princess was no other then the Tortoise-Shell Cat, who had been changed back to her own form after Hans had performed the tasks she had given him to do. After the carriage of the princess came a long retinue of servants. The procession stopped, and the princess spoke to the miller. "Here," she said, "is the horse which Hans earned by his faithful work. Is it as fine as those which your other apprentices brought?" At that, the two older apprentices hung their heads in shame. "The horse is yours," she continued, "but as for Hans, I want him to spend the rest of his days at my castle, where he proved his kindness and worth." Then the princess had Hans clothed in beautiful garments, such as a prince might wear, and she took him up in the carriage beside her and drove away. And Hans lived happily in the castle with the princess ever after. End of section 12. Section 13 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Darrow COWLES. The Healing Water, from Grimm. There once was a king who was very ill, and nothing whatever could be found to cure him. Now the king had 3 sons who looked so much alike that people who had seen them but a few times could not tell one from the others. One evening, as the 3 sons walked sorrowfully in the palace gardens, they met a little man, who said to them, "You grieve because your father, the king, is ill. I know what will cure him. If one of you will go to the enchanted castle in faraway land, and dip from its fountain a chalice of its healing water, your father shall drink it and live. But," continued the little man, "I cannot tell you the way to the castle. That is for you to find out. But I warn you, 'tis a dangerous journey." With that the little man bowed and vanished. "I will go," said the eldest son. "It is my right." So he ordered the finest horse in all his father's stables, and set out to find the enchanted castle and the fountain of healing water. He had gone but a short distance when he met a dwarf in the road. "What is your errand?" asked the dwarf, doffing his cap politely. "'Tis my own affair," replied the eldest son haughtily as he rode by. "Aha," said the dwarf when he had passed, "haughty people ask no help, and they receive none." The eldest son rode on, and the path he took led him between 2 mountains, and presently he found himself wedged in between walls of rock. He could go neither forward nor backward, nor could he turn around, and there he stuck, for the dwarf, whom he had needlessly slighted, had willed it so. A long time passed, and when the eldest son did not return, the second son said, "I fear some evil has befallen our eldest brother. But our father the king must have the healing water. I will set out to seek it." So he chose the best horse in all his father's stables, and set forth to find the enchanted castle and the fountain of healing water in faraway land. But it happened to him as it had to the eldest brother, for he too met the dwarf, who asked him, "What is your errand?" And he answered quite as haughtily as his brother had done, "'Tis my own affair." Then he rode on into the mountains, and became wedged between 2 walls of rock, so that he could not go forward nor backward, nor could he turn around. And there he stuck, for the dwarf had willed it so. After a time, when the second son did not return, the youngest son said, "Surely some evil has befallen my brother, but my father must have the healing water." So he too set out to seek it. When he had gone a little way, he met the dwarf, who asked him, "What is your errand?" The youngest son, whose name was Otto, stopped and answered respectfully, "My father, the king, is ill. I seek the enchanted castle in faraway land, wherein is the fountain of healing water." Then the dwarf said, "Since you have answered me respectfully, I will help you." So he told Prince Otto how to find the way to the castle, and he gave him a rod and 2 wheaten loaves. "The gates of the castle are of heavy iron," he said, "and guarded by 2 fierce lions. But if you knock upon the gates with this rod, they will open, and if you throw a wheaten loaf to each lion, they will not attack you. You will find the fountain in the court of the castle. Dip from it a chalice of water and hasten away. When the clock strikes 12, the iron gates will close again." Then Prince Otto thanked the dwarf for his help, took the rod and the bread, and rode away. And it turned out just as the dwarf had told him. He reached the castle gates safely and struck them with his rod. They opened, and the two lions ceased roaring and ate the bread that he threw to them. Then he made his way into the broad and beautiful court. There he saw a wonderful fountain of silver, and the water fell from it in a silver spray. Beside the fountain stood a lovely princess, who smiled upon the prince and told him he was welcome to fill his chalice at the fountain. So he filled it gladly. But instead of hastening away, as the dwarf had warned him, he lingered to speak to the lovely princess. And as he talked with her, he forgot the lions and the iron gates, till suddenly he heard a distant clock striking the quarter before 12. Then he hastened away, but not until the princess had given him a kiss and promised to marry him at the end of a year. As Prince Otto ran toward the heavy gates, they began to move, and as they closed, they clipped off a bit of the prince's heel. But he held close the chalice of healing water, and he had the princess's promise to marry him, so the hurt of his heel mattered little. Then Prince Otto rode away, but he had not gone far when he met the dwarf. "How did you fare?" asked the little man. "I have filled the chalice," said the prince, "and I thank you for your aid. But tell me," he added, "where may I find my brothers? My father will grieve if they do not return." "They are haughty men," said the dwarf, "and they will be jealous of you for finding the healing water. You will fare better without them." "But my father the king will grieve sorely if they do not return, and I wish to find them." So the dwarf directed Prince Otto to the mountains, where his two elder brothers were held fast, and he rode rapidly and released them, and they went back with him to their father's palace. On the way Prince Otto told them all about his adventures, and showed them the chalice of healing water. He also told them of the lovely princess, and of her promise to marry him at the end of the year. But the two elder brothers were jealous, as the dwarfs had said they would be, and though they pretended to feel glad, they really were filled with envy and with angry thoughts. After a long journey they reached their father's palace. Then there was great rejoicing, for the king drank of the healing water and became well and strong once more, and all the people were glad and praised Prince Otto. This caused the elder brothers to become more jealous than ever, and though they said nothing to each other about it, they both resolved to win the princess away from their younger brother. Now, as the end of the year drew near, the princess ordered that the approach to her castle be paved with pure gold, and this was done, and the year was up on the day after the pavement was finished. Then the princess said to her servants, "Whoever rides straight up the golden pavement and asks for me, admit, but none other." Not long after a horseman came riding swiftly. He looked like the prince who had filled his chalice at the fountain of healing water. It was the eldest brother of Prince Otto. When he saw the golden pavement, he checked his horse. "That is only for the feet of the princess," he said, and riding to the left, he approached the castle and asked for the maiden. But the servants sent him away, as the princess had commanded. A little later another horseman came riding swiftly. He also looked like the prince who had filled his chalice at the fountain of healing water. When he saw the golden pavement, he turned to the right, saying, "I will not tread the princess's gold underfoot. I would put it to better use." This was the next older brother of Prince Otto, and he reached the palace and asked for the princess. But the servants sent him away, as the princess had commanded. Soon after a third horseman, who looked exactly like the prince who had filled his chalice at the fountain of healing water, came riding swiftly. And this was Prince Otto himself, and he was so eager to see once more the beautiful princess who had won his love that his eyes looked straight ahead, and he did not even notice the pavement of gold. And he rode straight up the golden pavement and asked for the princess, and the servants threw wide the doors, and the princess came forth to greet him. So they were married as the princess had promised, and they lived in great contentment ever after. End of section 13. Section 14 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Darrow COWLES. The Lad Who Wondered. From Dasent. Once, many years ago, a man who was very poor had 3 sons, whose names were Peter, Paul, and John, and he sent them out into the world to seek their fortune. Peter and Paul, the 2 older sons, took matters very much as they came, and spent but little thought upon them. But John, the youngest son, who was called Jack, was always wondering about this, and investigating that, and trying to find out the reason for things. The older brothers made fun of this habit of his, but this did not trouble Jack at all. "What good does it do you to run after this and that?" they asked him. "Oh, I have the fun of finding out about things," answered the youngest brother, with a laugh. They had not gone far on their travels when they met a servant of the king's household, who stopped to exchange a bit of gossip. "What is the news of the day?" asked the brothers. "The king is greatly troubled," replied the servant. "He wants the great oak that grows by the palace cut down, but no one can be found who can hew it. As fast as a chip is hewed out, 2 grow in its place, so instead of getting rid of the tree, he finds it growing larger and larger." "Is that all the king's trouble?" asked Jack, thinking that even a king might find matters worse than this to trouble him. "No, that is not all," said the servant. "The palace is built upon high ground, and there is no well of water near. The king wants a well dug near the castle, and no one can be found to dig it, for all strike solid rock as soon as they begin." "And what will the king give to one who hews the tree and digs the well?" questioned Jack again. "He will give him the princess for his wife, and as much gold as he needs," replied the servant. "And do you think you can dig the well and fell the tree?" asked the older brother scornfully. "It is worth trying for," said Jack. At this the older brothers burst into loud laughter, and the servant said, "But whoever tries and fails is banished to a lonely island. The king has grown ill-tempered from having his oak made larger and his ground dug into for naught." With these words the servant went on his way, and the 3 brothers resumed their journey. As they travelled along, a sound of hewing and chopping fell on their ears. It seemed to come from the midst of a forest, high up on a hillside. "I wonder what that means," said Jack. "What does it matter to you?" asked the others. But Jack sprang up the hillside, while Peter and Paul lay down, grumbling at having to wait for him, yet really glad of an excuse to sleep by the roadside. Presently Jack came upon a strange sight. It was that of an axe hewing of its own accord at a great tree, and at the 3rd blow the tree fell. Then Jack addressed the axe and said, "So you can hew all alone?" "I can," said the axe, "and you had better take me along with you." So Jack took the axe and put it into his leather pouch. Then he joined his brothers, and they went on together. After a time they came to a great heap of rock, and on the other side there was a sound of digging and shoveling. "I wonder what that is," exclaimed Jack. "What does it matter to you?" grumbled the brothers. But Jack was already climbing over the rocks, so the brothers again lay down to sleep. When Jack reached the farther side of the great boulder, he saw another strange sight. A spade was digging and shoveling right through the rock, and all of its own accord. Then Jack addressed the spade and said, "So you can dig all alone?" "I can," said the spade, "and you had better take me along with you." So Jack took the spade and put it in his leather pouch. Then he joined his brothers, and they went on together. They had not gone far when they came to a stream of water. "I wonder where this stream comes from," cried Jack. "What does it matter to you?" growled his brothers. But Jack was already running along the bank of the stream, and as it was cool and shady there, the brothers once more lay down to sleep. Jack went on, and the stream grew smaller and smaller, till at last he came to a little cave, and in the cave lay a little acorn, out of which the stream was flowing. Then Jack addressed the acorn and said, "So you alone furnish water for this beautiful stream?" "I do," said the acorn, and you had better take me along with you." So Jack stopped the hole in the acorn with moss and put it in his pocket. Then he joined his brothers, and they went on together. Presently they came in sight of the king's palace. "I am going to try for the king's reward," said Jack boldly. "Ho, ho, ha, ha," laughed the brothers. "You will end your days on the lonely island, but good luck to you. We can travel the faster alone." Then Jack went boldly to the king and told him he was ready to try his hand at hewing the oak and digging the well. "You know the penalty if you fail," growled the king. "Yes, your majesty," said Jack. "Then try," said the king, and Jack drew out his axe and said to it, "Hew away now." At the third blow the great oak fell. Now the princess was looking from one of the windows of the castle, and when she saw Jack she said to herself, "I hope he will succeed." For though Jack's clothing was mean, he had the manner and bearing of a true man. As soon as the tree had fallen, Jack drew out his spade, and he said to it, "Dig away now," and the spade began to dig right through the rock, and in a very short time it had a great well made. Then Jack let himself into the well, and taking the acorn from his pocket, he laid it in a corner of the rock and pulled out the bit of moss. "Flow away now," he cried as he clambered out, and in a few moments the well was full of water, and a little stream went tumbling over the cliff in a beautiful cascade. The king was delighted, and all his followers shouted. Then the king said, "You have done your work well, and the prize is yours." Then he clothed Jack in splendid apparel and led him to the princess, who was all blushes, and as soon as the wedding feast was made ready, they were married and lived happily ever after. End of section 14. Section 15 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Darrow COWLES. The Lad Who Visited North Wind, from Dasent. Once upon a time there lived a lad in the North Country whose mother was very poor. She was a widow, and they two were all alone, and the only food they had was a little grain. One morning his mother said to him, "Lad, go to the wee bit of a barn and bring me some grain. I must grind it and bake us some cakes. There is nothing left in the house to eat." So the lad went to the wee bit of a barn and got some grain and came out again. But just as he stepped from the door, swish, came North Wind and blew away every kernel. Then the lad went back into the wee bit of a barn and got a second bowl of grain, and as he stepped out the door, swish, came North Wind again and blew all the grain from the bowl a second time. Well, at that the lad went back and got a third bowl of grain, and that was all the grain there was left in the barn. And when he went out the door, swish, came North Wind a third time and blew away every kernel. "Now we have nothing left to eat," cried the lad. "I am going to North Wind and ask him to give me back our grain." So off he started, and he traveled a long, long way, but at last he came to North Wind's house, and he went up and knocked boldly on the door. Then North Wind opened the door with a bang. "Good day," said the lad. "Good day," roared North Wind. "I came to return your visit," said the lad. "My visit?" roared North Wind. "Yes," said the lad, as fearless as could be. "You came to our house and snatched away all the grain from my bowl, and now my mother and I have nothing left to eat. I came to ask you to give it back." "Wee wee," said North Wind with a shrill whistle. "As bad as that? Why, I didn't know it was all the grain you had. I can't give it back, because you see no two grains are in the same place, but I'll do the best I can. Here is a tablecloth you may take home with you. Whenever you are hungry, say, 'Cloth, spread the board, and give me somewhat to eat,' and you will have a better feast than ever your grain would make." So the lad thanked North Wind, tucked the tablecloth under his arm, and went away. But he had come far, and it grew dark before he reached home, so he turned into the door of an inn for a night's lodging. As he was hungry, he sat down beside a table and laid his cloth upon it and said, "Cloth, spread the board, and give me somewhat to eat." Immediately the cloth was covered with dishes of substantial food, besides dainties the like of which the lad never had seen before. He ate heartily, while the landlord and his guests stood by in amazement. But while the lad slept that night, the crafty landlord stole away the magic cloth and put another, which looked the same, in its place. In the morning the lad tucked the cloth under his arm and hastened home, that he might share his breakfast with his mother. But when he laid the cloth on the table at home and spoke the magic words, not even a crust of bread appeared. "Well," cried the lad, for he was a sturdy lad, "I will go to North Wind again." So off he trudged as before, and knocked boldly at the door of North Wind's house. Bang! The door opened, and "Good day," said the lad. "Good day," said North Wind. "That tablecloth that you gave me is not any good," said the lad. "It served me one good meal, but no more. I want the grain that you snatched from my bowl." "I cannot give you the grain," said North Wind, "but I will do the best I can. Here is a hen. Take it with you, and when you have need, say, 'Hen, hen, give me a golden ducat,' and every time the hen will lay a golden ducat for you." "Fine," said the lad. Then he thanked North Wind, and tucking the hen under his arm, he started off. When he reached the inn, it was again dark, so he turned in for the night. But as he had no money to pay for his supper, he said to the hen, "Hen, hen, give me a golden ducat." And the hen laid a golden ducat, and the landlord and his guests all stood about and wondered. But while the lad slept, the landlord took away the hen which the North Wind had given, and in its place put one of his own hens of the same color. When the lad wakened, he hastened away home to show his mother the wonderful hen. But when he said, "Hen, hen, give me a golden ducat," the hen laid nothing at all. "Well," cried the lad, for he was a plucky lad, "there is nothing for it but I must visit North Wind again." So off he started, and reaching North Wind's house, he knocked boldly on the door. "Good day," said he as the door banged open. "Good day," said North Wind. "I have come for the grain that you snatched from my bowl," said the lad. "The hen that you gave me laid a single ducat, and now it lays no more." "Well, well," said North Wind, "we must see about this. I cannot give you back your grain, for no two kernels are in the same place, but here is a good stout rope. It can tie up a thief in a twinkling, and no man can untie it. You have only to say, 'Tie, rope, tie,' and the thief is caught. If you want to let him go, say, 'Loosen, rope, loosen,' and the knot will untie." Then North Wind laughed, and the lad laughed, for they both had their suspicions, and the lad thanked North Wind, and tucking the rope under his arm, he started off. As it grew dark, he reached the inn, and turned in for the night. He placed the rope beside his bed, and pretended to sleep. Presently the landlord came into his room and looked about. He carried in his hand a rope which looked just like the one by the lad's bedside. "I wonder what marvelous thing the rope can do," he said to himself, putting out his hand to take it, when the lad cried, "Tie, rope, tie," and in a twinkling the landlord was bound hand and foot. "Now," said the lad, "do you give me back my magic cloth, and my hen that lays gold ducats?" And when the landlord found that no one could untie the rope and loose him, he ordered the magic cloth and the hen to be brought and given to the lad. And when the lad had them safe under his arm, he cried, "Loosen, rope, loosen," and immediately the rope fell off, and the lad gathered it up and went on his way. He went straight home to his mother and said, "Mother, you shall go hungry no more. I have my magic cloth which spreads a feast, my good little hen which lays gold ducats, and a rope to tie the thief who tries to steal them from me, and we will blame North Wind no more for snatching away our grain, for he is a right good fellow after all." End of section 15.
Section 16 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Darrow COWLES. The Goose Girl by Grimm.
Once upon a time there was a princess who had been promised in marriage to the prince of a faraway country. As the time for the wedding drew near, the queen prepared beautiful dresses and rich embroideries and costly ornaments of gold and silver and all the finery that a young girl loves to wear. "I want the prince to be proud of his bride," said the queen, as she tried the dresses and ornaments upon the princess. And the princess smiled happily as she thought of the wedding. Now the wedding was not to take place at the castle of her father, but at the home of the prince in the faraway country. It was a long journey, but the king chose his most trusty horse, Falada, to carry the princess to her new home. And the queen chose the most beautiful maid in all the king's household to accompany the princess. And the maid too was given a fine horse from the king's stables to ride. Now Falada, the horse which was to carry the princess, could talk, but only the king knew this. Just before they started, the queen handed a small packet to the princess, saying, "Keep this with you. It contains a lock of my hair, and it will act as a charm. When you are in trouble, it will help you." So the princess thanked her mother with tears in her eyes, and she said, "Farewell," to the king and all the household, and set off upon her journey. But the maid whom the queen had chosen was envious of the princess, and as they rode on she kept thinking, "Why should the princess have the best of everything? The queen chose me because of my beauty. Perhaps I can find a way to win the prince for myself." Presently they came to a stream of clear water, and the princess said to the maid, "Bring me a cup of water to drink. I am thirsty from the dust of the way." She drew from her bodice a golden cup which the queen had given her, but the maid replied insolently, "If you wish a drink, get it for yourself. Why should I wait upon you?" Now the princess was very young, and she knew not what to do, but her thirst was so great that she slipped from off her horse and knelt beside the stream to drink. And as she stooped, the packet which the queen had given her slipped from her bodice into the stream. The princess's eyes were so blinded with tears that she did not see it, but her maid saw it and was glad. "Now she is no longer protected by her charm. I can do what I will," she said to herself. As the princess rose to remount Falada, she was astonished to see her maid upon Falada's back. "Give me your veil and your embroidered gown," said the maid, "and put on my coarse dress in their place. I shall present myself as the bride, and if you dare to contradict me, I shall have you thrown into a dungeon." The poor princess could do nothing but weep, and she mounted the horse which had been given her maid, and followed sorrowfully on till they came to the castle. There the maid presented herself as the true princess, and asked that some work be given the young maid she had brought with her as a companion. So the true princess was sent into the field to help the goose boy tend the geese, while the maid was led into the castle, where there was great rejoicing and feasting. For several days the feasting continued, and each day the true princess went into the fields with Curdken, the goose boy, to tend the geese. On the way to the fields they had to pass the stables where the king's horses were kept, and each time they passed the princess cried out, "Oh, Falada, Falada, what would my mother say?" And a voice from the stables answered, "Oh, princess, princess, with the geese you shall not stay." Then the princess would go on somewhat comforted, while Curdken wondered, but said nothing at all. Out in the fields the princess let down her beautiful hair, which was all of pure gold, that she might dress it. When Curdken saw this, he said, "Oh, let me cut off a lock, it is all of shining gold." And he stretched out his hand to grasp it. But the princess called out, "Breeze, blow Curdken's hat away." And hardly had she spoken when Curdken's hat was lifted from his head and carried quite outside the field. When he had caught his hat and come back, the princess's hair was all dressed and coiled softly about her head, where it shone like a golden crown. Every day the princess called to Falada, "Oh, Falada, Falada, what would my mother say?" And the voice from the stables answered, "Oh, princess, princess, with the geese you shall not stay." And every day the princess let down her shining golden hair, And when Curdken would snatch a bit of its gold, she cried, "Breeze, blow Curdken's hat away." And immediately Curdken's hat would fly quite out of the field. And every day the feasting and rejoicing continued in the castle. Now the king of the faraway country was very fond of horses, and one morning as he went through his stables he stopped before Falada's stall and exclaimed, "What a magnificent horse! It is the one which the princess rode." No sooner had he said this than Falada answered him, "The princess true is with the geese. The princess false is at the feast." The king stood still in astonishment. "What is this I hear?" he cried. "The princess true is with the geese. The princess false is at the feast," repeated Falada. As the king hurried from the stables, he almost tripped over Curdken. "Your Majesty," said Curdken, "I cannot have the strange maid with me longer," and he was all a-tremble with fright. Then he told the king how the Goose Girl spoke as she passed the stable, and of the voice that answered, and he told the king of the Goose Girl's golden hair and of how the breeze obeyed her. When he had finished, the king himself was all a-tremble with amazement, and he went straight to the field where the princess was tending the geese. At first she was afraid to tell him her story, because her maid had said she should be thrown into a dungeon. But the king told her not to fear. "Only tell me the truth," he said, "and I will protect you. I am the king." Then she told him all, and it was just as Falada had spoken. So the king took her by the hand and hurried to the castle. And he had her dressed in beautiful garments and led her to the prince. The bishop was about to marry the prince to the false princess, but when she saw the king leading the true princess into the room, dressed all in beautiful garments, she fled from the castle, and no one ever saw her again. So the prince was married to the true princess, and they lived happily ever after. End of section 16. Section 17 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Darrow COWLES. Section 17. The Spring in the Valley. An Irish Folktale. On a large island in the midst of a great sea, there is a beautiful lake whose waters shine clear as crystal. On a quiet night, if your eyes are bright enough, you may look down through the water to its deepest depth, and there behold a wonderful sight. You will see a great stone palace with turrets and arches and gardens with flowers and shrubs and trees. You will see a high round wall with an opening like a door, and a solitary man with a crown upon his head, who seems always to be searching. Now you should notice this wall and its opening most particularly, for without it there would be no story for me to tell. Once, long years ago, where the lake now lies, there was just a quiet green valley. And bubbling up from the midst of the valley, there was a spring of cool, crystal clear water. All the people of the valley used the water. They used it to make broth for the babies, and porridge for the old men and women. They used it to cool the fevered brows and parched lips of those who were sick. Travelers drank of it, and blessed heaven for water. Now there was a king living in the valley, and the spring was close beside his palace gates. And as the king saw the great numbers of people going day after day to the spring for water, he said to himself, "This will never do. There is no such water as this in all the world, yet every peasant drinks of it as freely as the king. Surely this should not be." So he determined to build a high wall about the spring and to make a door in the wall. And when it was finished, he locked the door with a golden key. "Now," said he, "I, the king, have control of the waters, and this is as it should be. No one can draw unless they use my golden key." Now the king had one daughter, and he declared, Only my daughter shall be allowed to bring water from the spring and to use the golden key." The people began to cry and to beg for water, but the king shut himself away and would not hear them. Then he thought within himself, "I will give a great banquet. Everyone in the valley shall be made welcome, rich and poor alike. And at the banquet I will give them as much of the spring water as they wish to drink. Then they will be grateful." So the banquet was announced, and the king's couriers rode forth and bade all the people come. When the time arrived, the king's banqueting halls were thronged. All the people of the valley were there. And besides, there came from a neighboring country a young nobleman of such grace and manly bearing that the king made him most welcome. And the young nobleman danced long with the king's daughter, and sat beside her at the banquet. There was one other stranger at the feast, an old woman whom no one knew. But as all who presented themselves were made welcome, no one asked whence she came. Now as they all feasted, the young nobleman said to the king, "I have heard much of the water of your spring. I should like to taste it." This was just what the king had waited for, and now he ordered his daughter to bring water in plenty for all the people to drink. But his daughter did not like to carry the water, for she thought it a task which the servants should perform. Then the young nobleman at her side said, "I will gladly go and help you." As they passed out the door of the banqueting hall, the old woman, whom no one knew, accosted the king's daughter. She held forth a metal vessel, beautifully wrought, and set with great glittering jewels, and as she did so, she said, "I have brought this as a gift to you. It is a magic vessel for carrying water. When it is full, the water will continue to flow from it, so that you need fill it but once, and all the people will be supplied." "Oh, thank you!" cried the king's daughter, taking the beautiful vessel in her hands and hastening to the spring. She turned the golden key, and the young nobleman pushed open the door. Then she knelt to fill the vessel, but as she did so, it slipped from her hands and fell into the spring. Immediately the water gushed forth in a mighty stream. It filled the wall, it rushed through the door, and poured itself forth into the valley. The young nobleman grasped the hand of the king's daughter, and together they ran to the palace. But the water reached there as soon as they. "Run! Run for your lives!" they cried. "The water is filling the valley!" Then all the people sprang to their feet. But above the confusion and noise, the voice of the strange woman was heard as she cried, "Now shall the people have water in abundance, and it shall not cease to flow till the magic vessel which I gave to the king's daughter is found and removed from the spring." Then all the people ran and reached places of safety, all but the king, who stayed behind to search for the magic vessel. The water continued to flow till it filled all the valley, and became a great lake as it is to this day. And the people built their homes about the lake, where they had water in abundance, and thanked heaven for it. The young nobleman married the king's daughter and took her away to his own country. The king who stayed behind was overtaken, but he was not drowned. Instead, he was condemned to live beneath the water, which he had wanted only for himself. And there he continues to search for the magic vessel, but he never has found it to this day. End of section 17.
Section 18 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by BettyB. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Darrow COWLES. The Magic Snuff Box. A Folk Tale. Once upon a time, there was a poor young man who started out to seek his fortune. He traveled many, many miles, and nothing whatever happened. "There is no luck in this," he said to himself. "I hope my fortunes will soon mend." Even as he spoke, his foot struck something hard in the path. It sounded like metal. He brushed aside the forest leaves and brought to view something white and shining. Picking up the object, he examined it, and to his surprise found it to be a silver snuff box. Some fine gentleman must have dropped it, he thought, for the box was set with brilliant jewels. He opened it, and as he did so, the box said, "Ask me, and I will help you." The young man was so astonished that he almost dropped the box, and quite too frightened to do anything but snap the lid quickly shut. But he put the box safely away in his pocket and travelled on. Toward night he came in sight of a great stone castle, such as he had never seen before. He walked all around it, wondering at its size and its magnificence. As he reached the front gates, there came out a man wearing beautiful garments, and with a crown upon his head. So the young man knew that he was a king, and that this must be a king's castle. The young man lay down that night in the woods opposite the castle to sleep, and while he slept, he dreamed. He dreamed that he was the owner of a castle even grander than that of the king. And his castle stood so close to the castle of the king that the king was envious of him. He wakened from his dream. It was still dark. He turned over, and as he did so he felt the silver snuff-box in his pocket. Then he remembered that the snuff-box had said, "Ask me, and I will help you," and he thought, why not try it? So he took the snuff-box from his pocket and opened it. "Ask me, and I will help you," it said as before. "Well then," said the youth, "I ask for a castle finer and larger than that of the king. I want it to sparkle with gold and jewels. Can you help me to that?" He had scarcely finished speaking when a most magnificent building rose as if by magic from the ground. And in the morning, when the king saw it, he was too greatly astonished for words, for his own castle looked quite mean beside it. He hastened to the golden castle, and when he saw its owner, he said, "Young man, I will give you my daughter in marriage if we may all come to your castle to live." And so the young man said, "Let me see your daughter first." So the king returned and brought his daughter, the princess, and she was so modest and so beautiful that the young man fell in love with her at once, and he was glad to do as the king wished. So the young man and the princess were married, and they had everything they could desire, and the king and queen came to live with them in the golden castle. But the queen was jealous and envious, and when she learned about the magic snuff-box, she could not rest day or night for thinking how she could get possession of it. At last she bribed one of the servants to find out where the young man, who was now a prince, kept the box at night. Then she bribed another servant to get the box and bring it to her. As soon as she had the box in her hands, she opened it, and it said, "Ask me, and I will help you." Then the queen said, "I want this golden castle set down far across the sea, where the king and I may live in it and have it for our own." And almost as soon as she had spoken, it was done. But the prince and the princess with their children were left behind, and had only the stone castle to live in. And as the magic snuff-box was gone, they became very poor, because the prince could no longer have things for the asking. Then one day the prince said to the princess his wife, "I will set forth and seek my golden castle, and my magic snuff-box of silver and jewels." So, bidding the princess and his children a sorrowful farewell, he journeyed forth. He travelled a long, long distance, and at last he came to the house of the moon. He told his story, and when he had finished, he asked, "O moon, in your travels over land and sea, have your rays shone upon my castle of gold with its jewelled casements?" And the moon replied, "No, my son, no such castle have I seen. But go to the sun, his rays shine farther and more brightly than mine. Perhaps he has seen it." So the prince journeyed on again for a long, long distance, till at last he came to the house of the sun. He told his story, and when he had finished, he asked, "O sun, in your travels over land and sea, have your rays shone upon my castle of gold with its jewelled casements?" And the sun replied, "No, my son, no such castle have I seen. But go to the wind, he penetrates where my rays cannot go. Perhaps he has seen it." So the prince journeyed on again for a long, long distance, and at last he came to the house of the wind. He told his story, and when he had finished, he asked, "O wind, in your journeys over land and sea, have you searched out my castle of gold with its jewelled casements?" And the wind answered, "Yes, my son, such a castle have I found. It is far away over the water, but come with me, and you shall soon reach it." With that he picked up the young Prince and carried him more swiftly than thought across the great sea, and set him down in a woods. And there, close at hand, he beheld his golden castle. That night he hid himself in the woods till all the castle lights were out, and then he let himself in with the golden key, which he had carried all these years since his castle was stolen away, and he crept up to the king's bedchamber and found the magic snuff box. He quickly opened the lid, and at once the box said, "Ask me, and I will help you." At that the king and queen wakened, and they called out, "Who is here? Help! Help!" But the prince was too quick for them. Before the courtiers and the ladies in waiting and the soldiers could reach the chamber, he cried, "Take me with my golden castle back to my wife and children, but leave the king and queen here in this land beyond the sea." And it was done. The king and queen found themselves left without a roof over their heads, but the prince with his golden castle and his magic snuff box was back in his own land with his wife and children, and they were happy all the rest of their days. End of section 18.
Section 19 of Favourite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jessica Allen. Favourite Fairy Tales Retold by Darrow COWLES. Old Mother Holle. From Grimm. Once, long ago, there were two sisters who lived together with their mother, who was a widow. Now, as sometimes happens, the two sisters were not a bit alike. One had bright hair and a fair skin, and she was as sweet and sunny in character as she was good to look upon. The other sister was dark and ill-favoured, while in character she was sullen and selfish. But strange as it may seem, the mother cared more for the dark sister, whose name was Ellen, than she did for Esther, the fair-haired daughter. She not only gave Ellen better food and better clothes, but Ellen's tasks were always light, while Esther worked hard from dawn till dark. When the other tasks were finished, Esther was set to spin, and as she loved the birds and the flowers and the grass, she took her spindle and sat down beside the well. She called to the birds, and they came and sang to her as she worked, and she tried to forget the harsh treatment and the unkind words of her mother and sister. But now and then her eyes would fill with tears, and so it happened one day that as she worked, she pricked her finger so badly that the blood came and stained her spindle. "What shall I do?" she cried in alarm. "If my mother sees my spindle so stained, I know not what she will do to me." So she leaned far over the edge of the well, hoping to reach the water and wash her spindle, but instead it slipped from her hand and dropped to the bottom of the well. With a cry, Esther leaned forward to catch it, but by this she lost her balance, and she too fell into the well. But then something very wonderful happened. Instead of finding herself in a wet, disagreeable place, she was in a green meadow where flowers were blooming, and the air was soft and sweet. She walked along a little path which lay before her, and presently she saw beside the path a great oven built of bricks, and inside the oven were many, many loaves of bread. "Take us out! Take us out!" the loaves called to Esther. "We are baked just enough. Oh, do take us out!" So Esther stopped and took all the loaves of bread from the oven, and then she went on down the winding path. After a while she came to an apple tree loaded down with ripe, rosy-cheeked apples. shake me, cried the tree to Esther. "My apples are ripe, do shake them down." So Esther stopped and shook the tree till all the ripe apples lay on the ground, and then she went on down the winding path. In a little while she came to a cottage, and there sat an old lady in the doorway. "I have watched you as you came down the winding path," said the old lady, whose name was Mother Holle, "and I would like you for a maid. I know you are willing, and I am sure you are neat, and that is all I require." Esther saw that Mother Holle looked kind and pleasant, so she was very glad to stop a while. Every morning Esther shook old Mother Holle's feather bed, and then the people cried, "Oh, see, the snow is falling!" And Mother Holle gave Esther good food and the kindest treatment. But after a time Esther said, "Mother Holle, you have been good to me, and I have been happy here, but I must go home to my mother and sister." Then Mother Holle said, "It is right that you should go. Come, I will show you the way, for you have been a good girl." Then she led her out through a door, and as Esther passed through it, a whole shower of gold fell upon her, so that her apron and all her pockets were filled quite full. Then Mother Holle pointed the way, and Esther ran home to her mother and sister, and when she showed them all the gold that she had brought, they treated her quite kindly. The very next day Ellen said that she too was going to find Mother Holle, for she wanted an apron full of gold. So she dropped her spindle into the well, and then she jumped in after it. And it happened to her as it had to Esther, for she found herself in a beautiful green meadow, and before her was the winding path. She had not gone far when she came to the great oven built of bricks, and full of newly made bread. "Take us out, take us out," cried the loaves. "We are baked just right. Oh, do take us out." "Why should I?" answered Ellen. "I do not want to dirty my hands with your oven." And she ran on down the winding path. After a while she came to the apple tree, all loaded down with ripe rosy-cheeked apples. shake me," cried the tree to Ellen. "My apples are ripe. Do shake them down." "Why should I?" answered Ellen. "Your bark is rough. It would hurt my hands." Then she ran on down the winding path. In a little while she came to the cottage, and Mother Holle was sitting in the doorway. "I have come to be your maid," Ellen said, without waiting for Mother Holle to ask her. "Very well," said Mother Holle, "but you must be willing and neat, and shake my feather bed every day." Ellen promised, and the first day she did it very well. She shook the feather bed, and the people cried, "Oh, see, the snow is falling." The second day she only turned the feather bed over, and the third day she did not think of it at all. "You are a lazy girl," said Mother Holle, "and I cannot keep you for my maid." Ellen was secretly glad, but she only said, "Then I must go home to my mother. Will you show me the way?" "Yes," answered Mother Holle, "I will show you the way." Now for the golden shower, thought Ellen, as Mother Holle led her to the door. But when she passed through, a pot of black dye tumbled down upon her. "That is all you have earned," said old Mother Holle as she turned back into the cottage. And when Ellen reached home, instead of an apron full of gold to show, she had only her dirty clothes. End of section 19.
Section 20 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Darrow COWLES. Eric No Luck, a Russian Folktale. Once upon a time there was a hunter named Eric, who went day after day into the woods in search of game, but no game did he bag. And this happened so often that at last he came by his friends to be called Eric No Luck. One day when, as usual, he was roaming the woods, he sat down to rest at the mouth of a cave where the air was cool. And as he thus sat, thinking of his ill luck and his poverty, he heard a tiny voice, which seemed to come from far, far back in the cave. "Help me! Help me!" cried the voice, but it was such a tiny voice that it sounded like the chirp of a bird. Eric's curiosity was aroused, and as he was a bold man and fond of adventure, he entered the cave and looked about. It was dark in the cave. The air was heavy, and the bottom was covered with stones and slime. "Be careful!" cried the tiny voice again as Eric advanced. "Mind where you step, or you may go 1,000 feet down to the bottom of this cavern." "Who are you?" called Eric, "and where are you?" "I am here in this jar," called the tiny voice. "I was shut in the jar 70 years ago by a wicked magician, and no one has come to the cave since. Oh, do let me out! I will repay you well if you will." So Eric No Luck picked his way carefully over the stones till he was far, far back in the cave. Then he saw a soft glow of light, and upon reaching it found that the glow came from a metal jar, and the cover of the jar was securely fastened by a heavy seal. Again the voice cried, "I am here, here in the jar. Just break the seal and out I come. Then I will repay you." "But how am I to know that you will repay me?" asked Eric. Try me,
said the tiny voice. "I believe I will," answered Eric, and with that he broke the seal, lifted the cover of the jar, and looked in, but not a thing did he see. "Where are you?" cried Eric. "Are you fooling me?" "No," said the voice, close beside Eric's ear. "I'm right here, but no man can see me, for to mortals I am invisible. But for 3 days you may ask of me whatever you will, and you shall have your wish. When you need me, call Murza, and say these words: 'Go where thou wilt, and bring what thou wilt.'" So Eric made his way out of the cave, and once more took up the bow and arrows he had left at the entrance. "I wish I might find a deer in the forest," he said, and then he thought, "Why not try my little friend at the trick?" So he called, "Murza, go where thou wilt, and bring what thou wilt." Hardly had he finished when he heard a crackling of branches, and a fine young deer stood under the trees before him. Swiftly he sped an arrow, and the deer dropped. "Aha!" cried Eric No Luck. "Wait till I show this to my friends." He started to carry the deer home, but he had not gone far when he met a gypsy leading a fine horse, and the gypsy offered the horse for sale. "I wish I had the money to buy it," said Eric No Luck. "Then I could carry the deer home in fine style." Then again he thought of his invisible friend. "Murza," he cried, "go where thou wilt, and bring what thou wilt." In a moment he felt something hard in his pocket, and thrusting in his hand, he drew out a fistful of gold pieces. With these he paid for the horse, and throwing the deer across its back, he mounted and rode toward home like a nobleman. But before he had cleared the wood, he heard horses behind him, and turning, he faced a whole band of robbers who had learned from the gypsy of the gold he was carrying. "Murza," he quickly called, "go where thou wilt, and bring what thou wilt." He had hardly finished speaking when there was a noise of galloping and shouting, as though a large party of mounted men were coming that way, and when they heard it, the robbers turned their horses and dashed off as fast as they could go. "Thanks, good Murza," said Eric No Luck. "Thou art truly keeping thy promise." As Eric rode on, he was presently joined by a youth who rode as fine a horse as his own, and who was dressed like a knight. He had a mantle thrown over his shoulders, and a plume in his hat, and a sword hung by his side. "You have a fine horse," said the youth. "If 'twere not for your deer, I would think you were on your way to join the Tsar's regiment." "And what is the regiment to do?" asked Eric No Luck. "Have you not heard?" asked the youth. "A large band of robbers is in the woods, and they threaten to attack the palace itself. They are dangerous men, and well armed, and they must be driven from the country." "And does the Tsar need a regiment to disperse these robbers?" asked Eric No Luck, thinking of his own recent encounter. "Indeed, you would think so if you had heard of the deeds they have done," replied the youth, as he galloped away. Eric rode on home with his deer, and when he reached there, he cried, "Here, friends, share the deer amongst you. I am going in search of better game." "How is this, Eric No Luck?" asked the men, but Eric had galloped away, while the men stood and gaped in astonishment. Now Eric had heard wonderful stories of the grace and beauty of the princess at the castle, the Tsar's daughter, and in his mind he had formed a plan which he counted upon Murza to help him carry out. "I must be better dressed," he said to himself, "before I can present myself to the Tsar." So he called, "Murza, go where thou wilt, and bring what you wilt." And in a twinkling he was clothed in gold-embroidered garments, with plumes in his hat, and a jewelled sword by his side. Then he rode gaily on, and soon he came in sight of the Tsar's castle. There were horsemen about, who had come to join the Tsar's regiment, but none was dressed as magnificently as Eric No Luck. He made his way boldly to the castle, and asked an audience with the Tsar, and when he was admitted, he said, "O Tsar, I have come to rid you of the bold robbers who have threatened your castle. Send these men away, I have no need of them." The Tsar was astonished. "How can you do this?" he asked. "I have an invisible friend who will help me," answered Eric, "and if I succeed, I want to marry your daughter." At this the princess began to shed tears, but Eric quickly said, "Murza, go where thou wilt, and bring what thou wilt." And after that the princess's teardrops turned to tiny golden rosebuds, to diamonds, and to opals as they fell. Then the princess stopped weeping for very wonder, and began to look favourably upon Eric No Luck. And the Tsar said, "Very well, try your luck with the robbers. If you succeed, you may marry my daughter, but if you fail, off goes your head." The Tsar frowned fearfully as he said this, and Eric trembled a little, for the odds were very great, but he said softly, "Mirza, go where thou wilt, and bring what thou wilt." Immediately the castle was surrounded with the most brilliant troop of soldiers ever seen in the land, and at a signal from Eric they dashed away into the woods, and the robbers scattered before them like dust before the wind, and were seen no more in the land. There was a magnificent wedding at the palace when Eric was married to the princess, and all his friends cried, "He shall no longer be Eric No Luck, but Eric the Lucky shall be his name." End of section 20. End of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow Cowles.